Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode 16. My guest today is Bernardo Kastrup. This will be his second appearance on the IdeaCast interview series, and I'm grateful for that, to have him back. If you aren't familiar with Bernardo Kastrup, I will offer a brief introduction. He is the holder of a PhD in computer science, specifically in reconfigurable computing and artificial intelligence. He holds a second PhD in philosophy of mind, and that is what we will be covering in this conversation, is his metaphysics and the ontology of that idealism works with. And so it's a long conversation. There's a lot of content. We begin with talking about the Essentia Foundation, which was started earlier this year by Bernardo and a bunch of other great people. And then we will be working into taking a look in the past and seeing the provenance of idealism and what brought that into being. Also, in the sort of a look into the landscape of the present, some of the cultural and social implications of the work that Bernardo's doing and the challenges in changing a cultural perspective and normatives, etc. So it's a long conversation, but I hope it's a substantive conversation for you, the viewer. I hope something in here is of good value to you. So join us, and thank you for coming to the IdeaCast interview series. I'd like to welcome Bernardo Kastrup once again to the IdeaCast interview series. Thank you for coming back, Bernardo. It's a pleasure to have you back, and I'm honored to have you back on my little series. So thank you.
Pleasure to be here, Justin.
Yes, indeed. I want to set a casual theme for today, but I also want to keep it fluid and not anything like an interview. I want it just to, we'll go back and forth and share ideas. But the casual theme I was thinking about is sort of time in the, not the scientific chronological sense, but just events, occasions and things like that. And so I want to look into the future with you, and then go into the past with you, and then maybe go up, if we don't spend 2 or 3 hours in the future and the past, go into the present moment. And I want to address a couple of things that have gone on recently with you in interviews and conversations, and so and some meta issues beyond the conversation. So going future forward, you mentioned in an interview about it was earlier this year, the role of Essentia and the work you're doing and the mission, the vision of Essentia. And you pulled out a specific date of about 30 years, which I would consider a generation. I want to press you about the implications of the work you and the others are doing with Essentia, with Fred and all the people who work with you. What can you unpack that and sort of explicate what you would like to see within a generation as far as a sort of a normative or paradigmatic impact, penetrating culture and penetrating society?
I've become more optimistic about that. I'm thinking now 20 years, we will see major changes. Yeah, the dream, the vision is a world in which we live without being informed by the self-evident fallacy that the materialist metaphysics is. Because not only is it wrong, I mean, it's bad enough that it's wrong, but it has nihilistic implications, and it can motivate very destructive behavior at a personal level and at a social level. Because, if matter is all there is, then the only conceivable goal of life is to accumulate matter while you can, regardless of the consequences of that for future generations or for the planet. And then once you're dead, you're dead. Anyway, your consciousness is gone. You have no stake in the future of generations beyond your grandchildren. You have no stake on that. You have no stake on the planet. So you might as well pillage it while you can in the short time you have, because everything has no meaning anyway, and there is no purpose. So yeah, we are subtly informed by this fallacious metaphysics today. And I think if we were to embody a different perspective, a lot of things would change. Meaning would return to life in a very self-evident way that doesn't require you to manufacture meaning or to create meaning, like therapists tell people to do. You have to create meaning, which is a sort of, if I have to create it, it's not really there. So it's a kind of self-deception, right? Yeah, that will be gone because meaning will really be there. The world will not be the thing in itself. The world we see will be a representation of a deeper level of reality that is mysterious to us and which we can contemplate from a perspective that the world at large cannot, because it is what it is. It cannot contemplate itself from an outside perspective. I think healthcare will change. Valuable as they are, avenues of care focused on surgery and drugs, which are very valuable. I owe my life to both. There is something else, which is talk therapy, personal experience, personal visionary experience, all kinds of things that we have every reason to believe, I think, if we abandon the fairy tale of materialism, that have an organic effect. We know they have. We call it placebo because we created the illusion that we understand it if we just put the label on it. But behind the word placebo, there is a profound metaphysical mystery because placebo shouldn't work, but it does. And if we understand why it does and how it does, we can leverage it without the name placebo, without this association with deception. We can address our psychic inner life through talk therapy, and that will have an organic effect because the body is just how our whole psyche presents itself to observation. It's not the thing in itself, it's a representation. So yeah, I could go on and on and on about the implications, but that's the dream, that's the vision. Now, how it will progress over time, that's a different question.
One of the things, I guess one of my motives in talking with you about this is, I assume Google's going to stick around for a while, and we'll see this archived in the records and historical documentation. And so you also mentioned in a conversation, I believe it was last year, that you can't control and you can't sort of shepherd how your thoughts and ideas will be taken and used. And intuitively, I don't see how ideaism or what you work with can be abused. But again, my motive for asking these questions is to sort of lay down a reference for people to come back to or to look at and see. So in other words, I could pick on something like language and focus closely on language. And so our language now, and God knows we could open up a huge rabbit hole of what linguistics is and what language is and signifiers and signified and the symbolic reference to language. Do you think that language needs to be taken along this journey of transformation away from, and certainly physicalism is not a dualist perspective. I would consider it to be somewhat monist for the most part, although it presents dual problems. But do you see language needing to be refined in any way to evolve and adapt with this new sensibility that will arise from the sensibilities that you present?
Of course. I mean, the language evolved for us to tell each other where the tree is that has good fruit, or where the tiger is hiding that might jump on us. Language evolved for very banal, everyday reasons. It certainly didn't evolve for us to talk about the profound, meaningful, salient aspects of the nature of reality. It didn't evolve for that. It also didn't evolve to capture the subtleties of private inner experience, because language needs to be grounded in shared experience. That's the only way a common dictionary can evolve. We know what a person means by tree because we both can look outside and see a tree. But if I have a unique feeling that I never heard described by anyone else, I don't have a word for that. And even if I create a word for that, the meaning of that word will not be grounded for other people if they didn't have that exact experience. So language is a huge limitation, and yet it's the only tool we have to communicate. Certain philosophical traditions have given up on language altogether. Zen Buddhism is an example. Certain versions of Vedic philosophy sort of give up on language. Even Neo Advaita explicitly puts language down, and what they want to do is to point in the direction that you have to go in order to have the experience yourself. They don't try to describe the experience. They try to enchant you or trick you into having the experience yourself, because the language just cannot capture it. So, and to continue on this vein of language, even for points that are very clear, trivial to say unambiguously in language, even in those cases, we have a disastrous history of misinterpreting what philosophers have said only 200-300 years ago.
Right.
I mean, Spinoza couldn't have been clearer when he said explicitly, I do not equate God with material nature. And to this day, over 300 years later, he's still portrayed as the guy who equated God with material nature. I mean, I can forgive people like Richard Dawkins, who's clueless, doesn't have the first idea about philosophy when
Right.
he says that, because he's just repeating what someone else said and it fits his agenda. So he repeats that. Yeah, okay, it's dishonest, but fine. But philosophers who are supposed to know better make that misrepresentation as well. Or Schopenhauer is today portrayed as a dual aspect monist.
Yeah, I
He
remember. Yeah.
explicitly said there is only the will, the representation is just an appearance, it's not the thing in itself. I
Mhm.
mean, you can go on and on and on with these misrepresentations, that they are tragic.
Yeah.
So if you ask me, do I think what myself and Essentia Foundation are saying today will be misinterpreted? Of course, it's a virtual certainty if we take a clue from history. I mean,
Right.
Nietzsche repeated for the best part of a decade how repulsed he was by German nationalism.
Mhm.
He was, and I don't agree with him on that regard, I think he went way too far, but he was anti-German. I don't think that's healthy, but he
Mhm.
was. And he didn't save words to make that point. And he repeated that point in multiple different occasions. And what did the Nazis do? They took him as a philosopher to base their nationalist agenda. I mean, it's just incomprehensible what happens. I mean, specialists or supposed specialists like Janeway, who is the editor of the new translation of Schopenhauer's works, the guy hasn't got a clue about Schopenhauer's metaphysics. He didn't understand the first thing of it. And what he then does, instead of recognizing that, well, I didn't understand it yet, I have to read it better. No, he just says Schopenhauer was confused. I mean,
Mhm.
this adds insult to injury. So would that happen to me? Of course it will happen. It will happen to Essentia Foundation. And the best we can do is to repeat our message as many times as we can, in as many different ways as you can, in the hope that people who will study seriously what we had to say will not be able to misunderstand us, because the thing will be repeated in so many different ways that there is only one overlapping meaning behind all those words and metaphors. But for the casual person, the casual philosopher, the casual student, or the worst type of them all, the militants, that will not be enough. That will not help. I'm certain I will be misportrayed.
One of you have two good things going for you, and I'll respond to that. First of all, historically, you have a lot going for you, and we'll get into that when we talk about the past, because there's a stream going here, and I want to connect the two. But also, yours is not obscurantism. Yours is not obtuse language. Yours is that you work specifically to bring it to the common person, the common intelligent person who does not have, say, a PhD or, and it's not sophistry. You're presenting it pragmatically, and so some of it can be argued and worked on, and there's a spectrum there. But I think one of the things benefiting you is that you aren't like Hegel or Husserl or Whitehead with just this utterly mind-shattering. I've spent 2 years trying to figure, and we'll get into Whitehead later, but I've tried to figure some of these people out. Accessibility to people is, I think, an essential part of changing the collective, changing the normative.
It depends on the historical juncture in which we are. I mean, back in the 12th, 13th century, people were illiterate. So there
Mhm.
was no point in changing the culture by convincing people of your story. You would just have to convince your colleagues or peers, and mainly the church, of what you were saying. So that was a time of scholasticism. In the late 18th century, yeah, we were in between. There was already more literacy, but limited. So people like Kant, he was writing for other philosophers, and he says that explicitly. He says, I'm not going to use metaphors in this book, The Critique of Pure Reason, because who will read these are my colleagues anyway, and they don't need metaphors. And moreover, the book would be too big. Never mind, it's already 800 pages.
Yeah.
So with Hegel, this elitist attitude reached a sort of an apex, a maximum. Hegel made a point of not being clear. I do not know what his motivations were. Clearly, he did not want to be understood,
Mhm.
because nobody writes in that uh, 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 incredibly tortuous way. If you want to be understood, I think he wanted to look more scholarly than every scholar in history by writing in that way. And I don't like him, not only because I can't understand much of what he has to say, but I don't like his attitude. It's a prejudice of mine. I dislike elitist attitude.
Mhm.
It sort of grinds on my nerves.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I have a natural antipathy for Hegel. Whitehead was not as bad, but in process philosophy, at least as far as I can discern, is a philosophy that tries to eat the cake and have it too. You can't
Yeah.
pin it down. It's so ambiguous, and you don't know what it's saying, because it's saying everything that can be said. And you're like, what the hell is it actually saying? Um,
It's a huge creole of ideas. Again, what you're doing, what idealism, however we got to call it idealism, is doing with your handling. And so let me go with this. One of the things I find people resisting about maybe not necessarily your idealism, but idealism in general, as it's being handled in the 21st century, is that they think about the old German idealists and absolute idealism, and you know seem to be more dynamic in your idealism. And I know you've mentioned in previous conversations that you're probably leaning, if I'm getting this right, more into objective idealism, but there is some essence of subjective idealism there. And you know, is it an absolute idealism? I think.
I'm not sure about the dynamic, in the sense that I have been saying the same thing for well over a decade.
Mhm.
So um, I'm not sure how to comment on. You said a lot, but there is today a lot of misunderstanding about idealism, but that reflects a positive step forward. People are talking about it now, and
Mhm.
before it wouldn't be talked about. So today, Lex Friedman asks the question from Sam Harris, what about idealism? That question wouldn't have been asked only 5, 10 years ago.
Right.
So it's back on the agenda. But then what you see people like Sam Harris and Michael Shermer more recently, the way they try to refute idealism is by, and I'm not saying it's insincere. I think that's their hallucinated view of what idealism is. They construct a straw man. What they consider idealism has nothing to do with what idealism actually is.
Right.
And then they burn this straw man. So what they refute is their hallucination of what idealism is. Uh, um, and both, and I blame Harris a lot more than Michael. I mean, Michael doesn't wave his philosophy degree around. He doesn't portray himself as an expert in philosophy, so that he doesn't know a foundation aspect of the idea of the philosophical canon in the West.
Mhm.
It's forgivable. He's a psychologist. But Sam Harris does portray himself as an expert in philosophy. He brandishes his Stanford bachelor's degree in philosophy around. So, and he portrays himself as a public intellectual who knows what he's talking about. So from him, I consider it personally unforgivable. It may be sincere in the sense that he was not aware of his own ignorance, but it's dishonest in the sense that he should be aware of his own ignorance, because it's his area. It's the area where he talks about. But both portrayed idealism as denying the existence of a objective world in which we all inhabit. Now, no idealist in history, not even Berkeley, a subjective idealist, not even him denied that there was a world independent of our observation. The point that idealists make is that this shared world is not physical, because physicality is a result of observation. Actually, there's quantum physics all over this. Avant la lettre, because people have been saying this for hundreds of years. So it's such a clear distinction, but people are so used to thinking in materialist terms that for them the word consciousness is synonym with personal consciousness. Now that amounts to saying that a wooden table is the same as wood. You see what I mean? A wooden table is an instance of the substance we call wood. Personal consciousness is an instantiation of the substance we call consciousness.
Right.
But when a philosopher says consciousness, the philosopher is referring to an ontological class, a type, not a instance. So when an idealist says the world is in consciousness, he or she doesn't mean that it's in your consciousness or my consciousness alone. There is a transpersonal set of experiential states out there which present themselves to us in the form that we call the physical world. In this way, the physical world is a representation of this transpersonal mentation, these mental processes out there. So idealism doesn't deny that there is an objective world. It just says that world is not physical. Physicality is just an appearance of it. But Harris doesn't seem to understand this. And this is not a matter of understanding, it's a matter of foundational knowledge, because this is explained in Philosophy 101. Even to, when I studied engineering, I had philosophy. And this was explained then. A 5-year course of engineering, I had one course in philosophy. So I think this is irresponsible beyond belief that somebody is ignorant to this point while presenting himself as a specialist in philosopher with a large audience, with the ability to influence our culture. I think this is a dishonest, irresponsible disservice to philosophy and to our culture by portraying things this way. Now, I'm referring to Sam Harris. Michael, I'm a lot less upset about his having done the same, because again, he doesn't portray himself as a philosopher. He portrays himself as a skeptic. So he was playing his role.
Right.
And on Twitter, he even replied to me and said, "Okay, let's have a conversation then about this."
That's good.
So yeah, no, kudos.
And you've been on stage with Shermer before, and I saw you guys are familiar with each
several years ago.
Yeah.
But it was not only me and him. There were other people too. I never had a
Well,
one-on-one public with him. I had on one-on-one at dinner, but not a public one-on-one.
Yeah, no, that's a good start. That's a good, and I think that would be a productive conversation. No, I remember that with Deepak Chopra, and he had Sages and Scientists or something like that. And Molitinoff was on there. I just remember Molitinoff having this Tourette's fit. Solipsism, solipsism, solipsism. And it's like, that points to what you're saying. It's like they just knee jerk into some kind of, again, their contrived sense of what you're not saying, their idea of what's being said.
Yeah, and that goes back to the first question, the second question you asked about the historical developments of these things and where we are in that line, that historical line. You see two very interesting things happening today. One is very few people. There is one exception to this, and I'll explain it to you. But very few people outside that exception are coming forward today to explicitly defend physicalism or materialism, metaphysical materialism. People are not doing this anymore. If you are involved in trying to get philosophical material to publish, and I am involved in that, I know other people who are even more involved in that than I am, we know that it's becoming very tough to get someone to come forward and articulate an explicit, in-depth defense of physicalism. People don't do that anymore. There is a reason why they don't do that anymore. It's because it's becoming very hard to do. Right. The only way to try to do that, and that's the exception, is to go all the way into absurdity, which is to deny that consciousness exists. Now, those clowns are still trying to do it. They are still being public about their case. But it is such a preposterous case that, yeah, very few people can take that seriously. Let us put it that way. It's a sort of a fossil from the 1960s
Yeah.
that is still resonating. But I don't think new generations of philosophers can possibly, even older generations can possibly take that seriously. But that's one thing that's happening. There is less defense of physicalism, explicit, proper defenses of physicalism. What you see instead of that is what you just referred to, the way Leonard Mlodinov made the point, which is instead of defending physicalism, they attack the alternatives by building straw men of them. Like, you know, we have two words, idealism and solipsism, for a reason. And the reason is they are not the same thing by any stretch of the imagination. But for the physicalists to still take the reason high ground, to come across as a no nonsense, intelligent, profound person, he has to first build a straw man and then burn that straw man and hope that in doing that, he didn't allow people to realize that he's actually not defending physicalism at all, because it's indefensible. That
Right.
he's substituting that in a kind of charade by a straw man attack. So that's what you see now: straw men's attacks on straw men attacks on the alternatives, in lieu, instead of a defense of physicalism. That
Yeah.
tells you the level of desperation that the mainstream now is in.
And I will say for Leonard Malinov's sake that he made a gesture. I think he and Deepak Chopra, to even be on stage with Shermer and yourself and a couple other people, you know, he's showing some flexibility, because I think there was an interview with him and he said, you know, there was a Caltech seminar and Chopra kind of gaffed and was talking about, like, you know, when you turn your head, the moon's not there, kind of thing. And you know, we could take that apart and talk about it, and it could make sense. But you know, in front of a 500 physicists, it didn't really set well with the crowd. But anyway, Malinov and Chopra got together, and Chopra was talking to him and helping him with meditation and mindfulness, and then Malinov was talking to him about physics and things. So they had. So anyway, I give Leonard Malinov that latitude in the way.
You alluded to potential openness on the side of certain militant physicalists.
I was trying to be,
Sure. I
thoughtful.
don't know about Leonard. Although I've met him, I don't know. Maybe he is opening up. Maybe there is sincerity there, genuine openness. But personally, without passing judgment on character, I think sometimes seeming openness on the side of someone like Sam Harris is a lot more dangerous than someone like Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is not dangerous. He will very quickly be seen as a clown by the majority, except for some work he did on biology that was not that profound, but it was good. It was a contribution. But Richard Dawkins in the 21st century is a clown. It's somebody who likes to debate very easy targets in order to get himself across as a tough man. So is that dangerous? Maybe it had an element of danger 15 years ago. I don't think anymore. I do think that the ones that portray themselves as open but critical and still put forward straw men and dress their ignorance with a coating of snub condescension and conceitedness, those are the dangerous ones, because there is a lot of people out there who are open-minded towards the truth, something that is not metaphysical materialism, and they buy into that openness. So they lower their defenses. They sort of take that person as somebody they can trust because that person seems to be open, and then are handed out burning straw man and bullshit, frankly, ignorance, quoted in a sophisticated delivery. And that can have a very detrimental cultural impact. I prefer Richard Dawkins because at least he's consistent with his idiocy, if you know what I mean.
Oh, absolutely. With Paris, he's just cagey enough, I think, to not mask it, but to present it. And I don't know, it would be fun to know his motive and know, is it mendacious? Is he really trying to undermine the options available to the public to consume? And he, as you point out, he may be a dual aspect monist, and where is he going? He has this little meditation thing on the side where you meditate, and it's in other words, I don't see a raison d'etre or whatever, however you would say that, behind Harrison's work, other than self-gratification, generating revenue, generating, because he's caught up in the gravity or the wave of his celebrity, I think. And I'm not trying to pick on him personally. It's just the what he produces.
I don't think there is any conspiracy here to maintain materialism. That's not what's going on. It's bottom up. It's not top down.
Mm-hmm.
People's motivations are usually much simpler and more banal than we suppose.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know Sam Harris's motivations, but one thing is clear to me: he has a very, very well crafted image. There is a lot of attention paid to his image, how he is perceived. A level of attention, for instance, that I don't have. I have zero attention to that. I should pay a little more attention to how I am perceived, but I do not manage my image at all. I'm coming talk to you today with a week-old beard and a t-shirt. And I'm always talking from my office without electronically changing the background. This is where I work. It's here. There's a ventilator back there, all kinds of electronic stuff on that table.
Yeah,
So,
very informal.
I make a point sometimes of crashing or trashing even my own image because I have a profound dislike of being a receptacle for projections.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why, but when I realize that if I notice or even if I suspect that people are placing projections on me, like Bernardo is a wise man. I already go. Look, oh, wait a moment. Let us break that idol quickly before it evolves into something else more pernicious.
Mm-hmm.
I do not like to carry projections of other people around. So there is a sense in which I even purposefully trash my image every now and then because I think it's very important that people understand that these are humans all on the same boat and we are all fallible. And by the way, we are all confused and we are all suffering. There is nobody out there who has all the answers, who is in perfect peace because he has complete domain and control, knowledge-wise, of what's going on.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist. We are all grasping at straws here. We are all trying to find our way through a dark cavern that is a labyrinth. But with some Harris, the image is very clearly managed to minimal details. I mean, the guy has basically a not a copyright, a patent on a certain type of a face photo, a certain way of framing his face. I mean, the whole thing is so managed. I don't know whether this means anything regarding his motivations, whether there is concern on his part, content-wise, to serve the management of his image, as opposed to just being absolutely honest regarding the content. So I don't know whether that's the case, but I can clearly imagine, I can clearly see a psychology that makes that the case.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it is the case with him, but if it is, it's understandable in a certain way because that's what human egos do. They want to safeguard how they are perceived, how they are seen, to build up their self-image as well.
Yeah, and he's been at it for quite a long time. I mean, I think he rose to prominence during 9/11. promptly put his foot in some Islamic dialogue, some conversations about Islam. But did anything come of that Twitter flap that you had called him out? Was there any outreach, or was it just ignored completely?
No, but it's, I knew that in advance. The first time I
Yeah.
challenged Sam, it was in 2012.
Oh, okay. So
A debate like
phone's been
that has
ringing a
been
long
tried.
time.
Yeah, and some people have tried to organize that debate before. So look, I'm completely aware. I mean, even his wife already debated me since then.
Yeah, Rachel.
So he's not going to debate me. It's too much to lose and very little to gain.
This is true.
And that's why I didn't even try to be friendly, because if you really think that you might have a chance to debate someone, you don't go all out. You try to keep the person engaged. I didn't even try to do that because I know he will not accept. If he does, if he's listening to this and has a change of heart, I would welcome that deeply. Let's have, an all-out conversation of 8 hours if need be, and hash these things out. But he will not. So the only thing left for me to do is to make it as uncomfortable and embarrassing as possible for him to not debate me. So that's what I tried to do in that Twitter series. And I don't do that merely out of some kind of thought through agenda. I think what he has been doing, and now I will disclose my personal opinion of his work. I think what he has been doing is terribly damaging. I think content-wise, his work is thin, superficial, naive at times. He puts forward as his ideas that have been already talked about for decades, and for which we have much better alternatives since then, ideas that have already been sort of set aside for a while. He writes with effect. He appeals to people's worst prejudices. And that's what people latch on to. They are being baited for that. And then on top of that, there is that carefully crafted image of an intellectual, which in my opinion is skin deep. It's very, very superficial, because when it goes to content, what I see from him is surprising ignorance of the basics. And not only about idealism. I mean, his moral philosophy book was like, come on, man, seriously?
I didn't even read it. I followed him for a little while on YouTube. I'd watch some of his podcasts and some of the excerpts from his, again, going up against people with belief systems, so rabbis and even debated with Shapiro and all that crap. And it's just, it's just television.
Look, he latched on the cultural revolt after 9/11 with a extremely superficial and prejudicial book that made broad generalizations for which there was no substance or argument to justify, but it latched onto people's worst prejudices, and it was coated with that mask of intellectualism, while in fact it was just an echo of people's prejudices, and they needed to latch onto that around a figure with manufactured authority. And I think that's what happened. I know a lot of my readership and audience likes Sam. Comparisons are made between me and Sam. I personally I don't blame people for doing that. I know where they're coming from. It's the style of argumentation superficially may sound similar, but I would like to think that in my case, behind the style, there's a lot of substance, and in his case, very little. So I see this comparison. I don't blame people for that, but I see it as offensive to me. So if people are going to dislike me because of my dislike of some areas, then so be it. I'm not trying to build a movement here, political party or anything, and I'm glad to dispel projections because I don't like to carry them. But yeah, I think he is a figure that is overall deleterious for the cultural debate. Yeah.
Well, I think people are just going to have to deal with the fact that you object to what he does, and to some degree, not the person, but who he is as a persona. And people are just going to have to accept that. Myself, I followed him for a couple of years. I've stopped. I don't listen to his podcasts anymore. I just kind of grew tired. And but the times, for a couple of years that I listened to him, he has some points. He has some like cultural critiques of American politics and things like that. You know, there's that he once in a while he sticks it and lands it on things, but you really have to wait. And I love his wordsmithery. You know, he's a very smooth talker, and he constructs sentences. So that's almost appealing and seductive in its own right. I see where people can get really
it's a very
vacuum into it. I like it. It's easy on the ears, but like you said, how deep does that run? Yeah,
it's a very carefully crafted image. But I think we need to be critical in our culture about idols, manufactured idols. In the US, there's a lot of that, more than in Europe, how you carefully manufacture a character, a sort of an icon or an idol that people place their projections upon. Sam is always using a certain type of suit of a certain color with a white shirt underneath and no tie in order to look more accessible. He's always photographed head on, which conveys that image of being accessible. His hand gestures, as he's talking about, are studied clearly. And his tone and pace of speaking carefully studied as well. And I say that because it's not something you would see naturally. And people, when they are acting natural, tone, gestures, behavior, body language change with the specific subject that's being discussed, whether it's closer to you or further away from you, whether it emotionally engages you or not, something you feel passionate about or not. And with him, it's sort of monotonic.
Oh yeah, yeah. In the years, and then again, I closely kind of watched him for 2 years, but I've known him for a long time, and I followed his work prior to that. But yeah, note to him or to his PR people that if you lose your shit once in a while, and because even during the Peterson Harris debate, Jordan Peterson lost his shit at one point. He just barked at the crowd because Harris was getting an applause for some snide thing that he said, and Peterson lost it. And I'm not a fan of Peter and I kind of rank Peterson the same way. It's like he touches on things, and I think for me, Peterson is a lot more helpful to the culture at large because he appeals to a certain cultural sector, and they benefit from him. So in the United States, a lot of conservative young people look to Peterson, and I think if they're going to look to somebody, Peterson is a good place to start. And so a lot of people, and you could critique his Jungian interpretations of things and his psychology, and a lot of people who are critical of Peterson in an ethical and a clean way say that he oversteps his bounds. He's like Harris. Harris is a neuroscientist, but he's all over the place in terms of ethics and morality and critique of religion and And they also say that Peterson's fairly brilliant, and that maybe he can be granted that to some extent, but I don't know. So I don't want to open up a huge thing about Peterson, but like I said,
I can't because I don't know much, enough about him to comment intelligently. But I'll tell you this: what I personally like to see, and the way I try to act myself, is honesty, openness, and humanity. I don't want to watch a robot deliver a carefully manufactured message, coated in all kinds of appearance management. I want people who are human, who are authentic. And it's part of our humanity to sometimes be angry, to sometimes be confused, to not know certain things, to become emotionally engaged in certain things, even to be unfair sometimes. It's also human. To me, it's very important that we not only preserve, but not hide our humanity. That's why of the four horsemen, which is, of course, now it's an artifact of history. It already begun as such, but now it really is. Of the four horsemen, there was one I liked, and that was Christopher Hitchens, because you could see his humanity. I probably would disagree completely with him, very emotionally disagree with him in a number of cases. I don't doubt that if I would spend a lot of time with him, it could get pretty serious, and it could get very acrimonious. but I liked his humanity. I liked that he was emotionally engaged with what
Oh
he
yeah.
was saying. I liked that he was honest to himself to the
Mm,
last. That if he didn't like somebody, he would say that.
yeah.
There was a time when he said, well, he was talking about Secretary of State during the Nixon era.
Slashing. Secretary of State. Well,
Oh, what was
before Reagan. Anyway.
he's still alive. Oh, how can I
Uh,
forget his name? My God, I take a medicine from my tinnitus.
yeah,
That,
sure.
anyway, and there was this interview in which he said,
Agnew?
"Well, I
No,
hate
Agnew.
him." Huh?
Vice president. Oh, Agnew was the vice president. I'm trying to sort through his cabinet. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, a very famous name.
It
But
wasn't.
anyway,
It wasn't the shuttle diplomacy with Vietnam. He was European. Um, now you. Anyway,
uh,
it'll come in.
it was even before Nixon, I think. Well, anybody. Anyway, I forgot. But he said, Hitchens said, "Well, I hate him. I hate him." Now, it's a very strong feeling. I'm not sure I could say about anyone that I hate them.
Kissinger.
Kissinger,
Yeah,
Henry
I
Kissinger.
was trying to
Yeah,
think of shuttle diplomacy during Nixon, and so yeah, finally.
yeah.
Sorry. Anyway,
And he said, "I hate Kissinger. I
yeah,
hate him." He said several times, and I thought, okay, I wouldn't say that about anyone, but if that's how he felt, I applaud that he was
be honest.
prepared to say that. He was not trying to manage and craft his image as a sober, objective intellectual. He just was honest to his feelings, and he just said
Mm,
that he was human.
mm.
He was human to the last. He was human during his cancer.
Yeah, towards the end,
So
yeah.
I applaud him. He may not have been the deepest intellectual in the history of the 20th century, but I applaud him for his humanity.
Mhm.
And I don't see that humanity in the other three.
Right. Hitchens for me was always a guilty pleasure. I would turn and watch him engage people, and I think he went too far. I really think the acerbic or vitriol attacks were unnecessary. He'd go up against Muslims or Catholics, and just like he would attack Mother Teresa. And I researched what his point was with Mother Teresa, and it was very ambiguous. And so it wasn't, given what she did, and I'm not a fan of her, and I'm not, a practicing Catholic, but just let the lady have her legacy, or woman, whatever.
But
Yeah,
understand
he
me.
would punch her in the
Yeah,
face repeatedly. Yeah.
but that's what I said. I told you I probably would disagree
Right.
broadly with
Right.
almost everything he said. But so I'm not endorsing the content
Right.
of
Right. No,
what
no,
he said. What
I
I'm
agree.
saying is I appreciate his humanity,
Oh
his
yeah.
willingness to be himself, and to not hide behind a crafted image.
Mhm.
And that's what I think we need, because we need to stop placing projections. We need to stop this idol culture,
Mm.
celebrity culture. If we don't withdraw our projections and put them back where they belong in ourselves, if we don't realize that what we hate in the Muslims, say people hate Muslims in the US, we were talking about Sam Harris and he bashed Muslims.
Oh yeah.
One of the reasons I consider him a deleterious figure is his broad generalizations of religious groups. I think that it's beyond unfair, that it's almost criminal.
Mhm.
But so let's say somebody in the US, one of your listeners, hates Muslims. Think for a moment about the possibility that that which you hate is in us.
Mhm.
I mean, what the Germans hated in the Jews just before the Second World War was in them. And we don't solve the problems unless we withdraw those projections and we see them where they actually live. And also, if we stop projecting our wisdom, if we project wisdom on other people, there will never be wisdom in us because we have surrendered that wisdom. We
Right.
have allowed it to go out of us. So withdrawing these projections, ending this idol culture, I think it's very important if we are to progress as a civilization. If people start realizing that what they hate is in them and the wisdom they look for too is in them.
Mhm.
Um, and I find deleterious to the discourse people who craft an image precisely in order to attract projections.
Yeah. The enabling of it. and you've cited recently your like I follow the sort of the emergence or evolution of your how you converse with people, and so you were talking about in a couple of conversations recently the innocence of the Americas and the culture of America. So in other words, the stuffing and tamping down of the shadow of the form that is our shadow side, and that has to escape. And I think that's an important message that shadow recognition and management needs to be acknowledged, handled, not dismissed. Because again, we make a very good point that we work very, very hard, whether it's through religion or through cultural expression, to only seek the good and to ignore the bad and to call the bad evil and to point towards those who act badly. And then that suppression, as you say, expresses itself in terms of mass shootings or weird cultural culty behavior that there is an underlying reason for it, but it expresses itself in some bizarre oblique manner that just is so incoherent and makes no sense.
Yeah.
And that's not healthy progression. That's not healthy advancement of the species and the collective mind, if you will. So I think you make a very good point, and I'm bringing that up in relation to what you're saying.
Justin, can we make a small pause? Because I need to go to the toilet.
Absolutely.
And I received an email 5 minutes ago that I need to answer. Can we make a pause of 10 or 15 minutes?
Back from our pause. And so, Bernardo, I want to move into talking about the past, but I want to also give you an opportunity to talk about the shadow, the projection, and the need to manage it.
I think, managing our shadow as a civilization, as a collective, it's probably the greatest challenge we have in front of us. Because for as long as we don't do that, we will go to war with each other. Our wars are basically wars against ourselves by proxy. We project what we don't like in ourselves onto others, and we wage war. This is not to say that everything we dislike in other people is always a projection. Of course not. I dislike Nazism. I am very critical of Nazis. That doesn't mean that I'm projecting my Naziness onto them. Sometimes a criticism is valid, and it's not based on projections. It's based on outrage. But often enough, it is projection, especially when it's generalized. When we start talking about entire groups, be it religious groups, ethnic groups, cultural groups, countries, when we pass general judgment, that's a big clue that we are working out our projections. We are placing our projections. We are sort of dishing out our projections. When it's an individual and specific thing, then it may be just righteous outrage. But every time you generalize and you pass judgment based on a generalization, it's judgment that is uninformed, because you cannot possibly know what all those people you're passing judgment on do, think, or are. You can't possibly know that. And then this arches back to some areas in the early 21st century, how he sort of latched on these projections. Projections we had against the Muslims. I mean, I am outrageous by the September 11th attacks. It took me a while, even though I was in Europe, it took me a while to sort of stop thinking about that, to stop being outraged about what those people did. But it's equally outrageous to now say, well, this is the problem with all Muslims. No, it's statistically certainly not the case. And to leverage that generalization is criminal. I think it's criminal, outright criminal, because we don't know to what kind of reactions that kind of content has led some people to, what they have done to Muslims. We don't know what the scale of the damage was, because you can't trace that back to what one person said. So since we generalize a lot in our culture, No, it's the Chinese that are the problem, or it's the Jews that are the problem, or the Muslims that are the problem, or the Asians. We are always generalizing, and
Hmm.
that's a dead giveaway that we are confusing reality with projection, and that's incredibly damaging. Um, Generalizations apply both ways, but because of our prejudices, we only think that they apply one way. For instance, I could generalize the Muslims in the following way, and this is historically grounded, what I'm about to say. They held the light of knowledge alive, nurtured, and cultivated it while Europe was lost in the throes of the Dark Ages. And when Europe finally began emerging from the Dark Ages, it was the Muslims who handed that back to us. Like, okay, guys, you went crazy. We kept it in safekeep for you. Now that you're recovering your sanity a little bit, it is back to you, enhanced, enhanced,
Right.
developed. The Muslim world has been the center of the world of philosophy and knowledge for centuries.
Yeah.
And I'm not only saying the Sunni world, the Shiite world too.
Hmm.
I mean, civilization was born in that part of the world before the prophet walked this earth, but in that part of the world amongst those people. And if you want to generalize the West, now take into account that Persepolis was the jewel on the crown of human civilization. It was the most advanced, most beautiful, most dazzling city on earth, and it was in Persia.
Hmm.
And it was burned to the ground for no reason by a drunken hooligan that in the West we call Alexander the Great.
Hmm.
So Alexander is the Great. And the
Right.
Persians or Iran, they are the evil now. So
Yeah.
you see, you can generalize both ways and you will be right in neither because generalizations don't work. It's the nature of the thing that they don't work. So we have to work it out. Otherwise, we will go to war with China, with Iran,
Yeah.
with the rest of the Muslim world. And who will be next? No, who will be next after that? Will it be your neighbor? Will it be the Latinos coming across the border? I mean, they are not even the next. They are they are there right now.
In
Will it be the
250
Canadians
years.
next?
Yeah. Things like nationalism or globalism and absolutism, absolutism and relativism, they all seem to be used and weaponized in a way that they shouldn't be. So, like me, I'm a spectrum person. So I like globalism and I like nationalism, but not either, right? I like that that spot where we can pull maybe some things and absolutism and you'd had this conversation with somebody the other day and relativism. I don't want to get into postmodern nonsense, but just the idea of it's one or the other. It's binary. It's either a dichotomy. It's this dilemma of dichotomy. And I say the same thing with nationalist people who aren't even really, they're demagogues and they're just manipulative people who are, doing their own shadow thing. And I would like to think that if reason can, by way of what you're doing, can be brought about, that might be toned down a bit, or people might find a spectrum for themselves or a scale, so that it's not either or, black and white, absolute terms, right? I'm
That's
asking
the
a
hope.
lot. I'm asking a lot of your lap right there. But
That's the hope. I mean, you couldn't call me a conservative or a liberal, or if you want to call me one of them, you have to call me the other two,
yeah,
because either I am none of them or I am both.
yeah,
The problems we face are too nuanced, complex, sophisticated for us to be able to deal in two options.
yeah.
Dealing in two options, in two opposites, is attractive because it gives permission to intellectual laziness. You don't have to think. You just paste a label on everything that is one of two options, and then you know everything you need to know about it. Of course, that's an illusion. You didn't even begin to know anything about it after you placed a label, because people, movements, ideas, the world is too complex. It's too nuanced. There is too much structure. But people don't want to spend the energy to be thoughtful. And that leads to this. I think it's a reflection of intellectual and cultural laziness that is exploited by people who figured that they have something to gain by sort of polarizing everything. Um, I refuse to be polarized or to be labeled or to be placed in a little drawer
Yeah.
with a neat little label. If you tell me I am a liberal, I will tell you I'm very much pro-religion. I think that we are not born in a vacuum. We are born in a historical context. We are the tip of a spear that spans back to all of our ancestors, and we owe a responsibility to them to try to answer the questions that they couldn't answer, to try to understand the things they couldn't understand, and to try to do it right in the places where they couldn't do it right. We have to be attuned to this historical chain of which we are the tip. And we have to understand that we are not loose individuals that have the absolute freedom to start from zero. That's not how this game has worked. We are born into a civilization. We are born into a cultural context, which has formed over centuries, if not millennia. So you'd say, well, I'm a conservative, right? I want to do justice to our ancestors. I feel that we owe a responsibility towards them. I'm pro-religion. I think one of the greatest problems we have is that we've lost our relationship with true religion. So I'm a conservative. And then I would say, no, because I think LGBT rights are human rights. I think it's an abuse of human rights to tell somebody that they are ill because they have a different sexual orientation. I think it's crazy to justify this attitude based on religion because we know, for instance, that 25% of Drosophila fruit flies are homosexual. Are they doing that just because they want to irk the researchers that study them?
Make a statement.
Yeah. And I could go on a rant here about
Right.
things that you'd consider totally liberal. For instance, I'm pro minimum unconditional income, and I'm willing to pay more taxes to allow that to happen because I think it would unlock a degree of creativity in our culture that we can't even begin to imagine right now. It would change our world. So yeah, Bernardo is not liberal or conservative, or he is both, because the point is there's too much nuance. Our problems are too complex to classify solutions in two buckets.
I agree with you. But let's go back to the pre-Socratics. And not too many ontologies can go back to the pre-Socratics and talk about this concept of, I don't like the word monism. And I also think that non-dual is a felt experience, much like conservatism. It's a felt, non-dualism is something that you have as a personal experience. So, but sort of the universality, so that the nous, as you call it, or the aperon that Anaximander mentioned. But let's talk about Parmenides. I love Anaxagoras, and you've been using the term nous lately. But these people, whether they were the Eleatic monists or the I forget the other region that these Anaximander and Anaxagoras were known for, although
it's the south of it.
Yeah, the Eleatics were in Elias on the west coast of Italy, but it's Militalia or something like that, like Thales and Anaximander. Anyway, it's probably has nothing to do with anything at this point, what we're going to talk about. But these guys like Anaxagoras and Parmenides' poem about being shown, and please forgive me, I'm not going to do justice to what it is, but it's just the absoluteness, the oneness. And it's been disputed. I know Bertrand Russell kind of poo-pooed that, but Bertrand Russell was Bertrand Russell. But these people weren't being informed by a previous culture. There was not a 2,000-year history prior to them that we know of anyway. So I'm wondering, we can bring in your daimon that you talk about. These people were informed by something, and so you had people again talking about one universal, as you say, an ontological primitive, and that some were saying it's sort of what's the type of monism? Not indifferentiated monism. There's a type of monism that's anyway. I've forgotten, but
dual aspect monism, absolute monism.
No, it's indifferentiated. I can Google it, but anyway, it's a monism that's about awareness, and it's not consciousness only, but consciousness is it's concurrent with that. So I say all this because we can go back to the early axial age and look at people who were talking about this, even Plato with the forms, pointing towards a singularity, if you will, or sort of a monist perspective on mind. And some would cross over into like a material monism, like substance, which was part Anaximander had this, an indefinite monism is what it's called. So it was an amalgamated monism.
Oh, neutral monism.
Maybe neutral. I know indefinite. I looked that up and was reading about it. Anaximander having been considered either a material monist or an indefinite monist. But the idea, so I want to open that up a little bit and talk about where these guys were getting this. And I say Daimon, I brought that into this to say that, were they tapping into something? I mean, what were their senses telling them? What were their intuition telling? What were their perception modes telling them?
Well, today it's trickier to talk about the axial age because 100 years ago we thought that all of those representatives of the axial age sort of lived more or less at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Now we know that that was not the case, that there are differences of hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Zarathustra or Zoroaster probably lived hundreds of years before what we now call the axial age, around 2,500 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it's no longer an appeal to a epoch in time. It's more an appeal to related ideas that popped up in civilization over a period of hundreds of years. But they had this commonality, this both metaphysical and ethical commonality. And then we refer to them as the axial age, although it was not really an age, it's more of a
transitional
type of philosophy, and so to say. So that's the first observation. The other one is that it's very difficult for us with the conceptual background we have today, our assumptions, even our prejudices, to interpret these people correctly. And if you want somebody who has discussed at length why this is very difficult to do, I would refer to the work of Peter Kingsley, who I think is perhaps the best classical scholar alive today. So what he shows is that at the time that these people were writing, they were not doing philosophy in the way we do today. In other words, they were not making an argument, a logical argument. They were not, in the sense we interpret logic to be today. They were not reasoning, or they were not describing how things are. What they were doing is what Kingsley called Metis, a kind of enchantment. So the writing was not a description, it was not an argument, it was a kind of a trick. It meant to trick you into sort of stumbling upon your own conceptual narratives, such that you could actually see what they saw. In other words, they were not describing what they saw. They were not arguing for what they saw. They were trying to trick you into seeing the same thing. So if you read Parmenides' poem, for instance, with these new glasses on, with this awareness that is meant as a trick, it's meant as a kind of incantation. It's supposed to sort of enchant you into, seeing something different. Then you realize that you have to be careful how you go about it, that those were not reasoning discourses, they were Metis tricks. Now, having said that, I think there is a little doubt that Parmenides alluded to unity, and that was a sort of a consistent theme across the axial age philosophies. The Aryans, for instance, and by saying Aryans, Aryans were not an ethnical group like the Nazis tried to portray. Aryans were the people who inhabited a certain geographical area in southern Russia, close to the Caucasus. So every time I say Aryan, I don't mean an ethnicity, I mean a geographical group of people. When they went to the Indus Valley and they came up with Vedic philosophy, that idea of oneness that sort of produces an appearance of diversity and conflict, it was already there, that very idea of oneness in a completely different part of the world. So I agree with you, certain core ideas were there, but we have to be extraordinarily careful about interpreting what they said. Now, where did that come from? Uh, Look, by the mere fact that we are the children of reality, we are born and we grow in reality. We are part of reality. We were never separated from reality. It's incoherent to even talk about separation from reality. We are bang in the middle of reality, whatever it is, whatever reality is. We are not neutral, objective observers contemplating reality from the outside, because that would be a view from nowhere, as some philosophers put it. There is no view from nowhere. There is only a view from within reality, and that's our view. We are part of it. So is it surprising that through our intuitive roots, through the non-conceptual, most, don't want to use the word primitive because it has so many bad connotations.
Almost an
Instinctual, but I'm looking for another word. But anyway, the most basic elements of our cognition, before the neocortex evolved, before symbolic thinking evolved, before conceptual narratives evolved, we were rooted in reality because we are part of it. And through those roots, we can intuit with more or less degree of reliability, but we can intuit what reality is because we are in it. We draw our nurture from it. We are rooted in it. So if you ask me where did those philosophies come from, well, that's where it came from. And it could come from me and you tomorrow if we had been born in an inhabited island, unburdened by the cultural stories that were given to us without our asking and portrayed as the truth. Because those are the narratives that now sort of dissociated us from our intuitive roots, because now we have a story that is the truth. So why should we pay attention to the intuitive truth that we sort of sense? That intuitive sense has been now overwhelmed and completely obfuscated by rational conceptual thinking. Although we still have those roots, the sense organs are there. Cognitively, we cannot discern them anymore because we are immersed in a world, in a culture of narratives. People all the time talking, watching the news, reading social media. Uh, we don't sense that anymore. But the Aryans in the Hindus Valley, who had they didn't even have an agrarian culture. They had cows. That was their main activity. They were exposed to raw nature. Once they managed to overcome, the urgency of a hunter-gatherer society, and they could have their cows and have their meat and the milk. Um, Life was no longer that desperation for survival every day. That there was a safety net built. They started contemplating reality through those intuitive channels because they were not clogged or obfuscated or overwhelmed at the time. Right. And they got to this. So it's not really a surprise that across cultures and across countries and geographies, people have come up with essentially similar ideas. Not in the outward description, because different metaphors are used. There are all kinds of gods and goddesses and creation myths. Right. But if you drill down to the essence, it's surprisingly common across the Witoto in South America, the Aboriginals in Australia, and the Aryans in the Hindus Valley. It's everywhere.
And it's probably safe to say that the Greeks and the Greeks who lived in Italy could have well been informed. I know Pyrrho and Sextus Empiricus were informed by our friend Alexander, who went in and did what he did in the East, brought back this like Pyrrhonian skepticism may have its roots in Agnana heterodox schools from early India. Yeah.
Well, there are different theories about
Right.
The similarity between myths. You mentioned one, which is commerce, that the myths originated in one place, and then different versions of it were transmitted verbally because people were beginning to engage in commerce and travel and Silk Road and whatnot.
Oh, right.
That's one theory. Another theory is that there wasn't a common origin, one origin, but there were parallel origins. Mm-hmm. And the similarity has to do with our cognitive apparatus. We are all human beings. Our intuition is shaped in more or less the same way. We live in the same world. We are surrounded by truth all the time, even though we don't have a conceptual narrative for it. Whatever the truth is, we are planted in the middle of it. And therefore, the myths are the same because they reflect some metaphysical commonality, so to say, as opposed to a commonality of origin. Now, in academia, there are decades of literature favoring both of these hypotheses, criticizing the other.
Yeah.
So, strictly speaking, one would have to say the jury is out there as far as academia is concerned. I don't think the question has been settled. It has been fought over for over a century, but it's not settled. But if you ask me, I have very little doubt that it isn't a single origin. The myths are similar because human beings are cognitively similar and we are all inhabiting the same reality.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that whatever commerce has brought the story from one place to the other and the story changed. It's because different people sensed intuitively the same underlying truth. That's my view.
Yeah, and I agree. And that's earlier I was, well, I agree in the sense that I think there was a little of each, right? So there was this sort of spontaneous, non-regionally dependent awareness coming to. And I think that's where I could bring non-dual back, where, people who would go inside or do whatever, the mindfulness or whatever they were doing, or just even, thought, like you said, unencumbered by structures outside, social structures and intellectual structures, or thoughts, et cetera, that they were able to open up that space and feel that sort of sense of oneness, of beingness for the sake of just being, but also that ideas were exchanged. So maybe it's, again, a blend or an amalgam of the two. But I bring it up because I think it's fascinating that there is this provenance of this idea of a oneness, a unity, a singularity, however you want to call it. We'll stop in the 13th century, give or take 50 years on either end, so 12th, 14th, and the mysticism, if you will, that emerged, at least that's well documented from that period. I'm sure it was happening all throughout human history, but what was recorded in both Europe and in the land of the Moors and into the Middle East, Sufism, Christian mysticism, and the fact that and this carries through what we were just talking about. What you were saying is that it's not regions, it's spontaneously happening in multiple places. And you have people like Mark Vernon brought up Ibn Arabi, and he quoted Ibn Arabi by saying, no matter where you turn, there is God, that kind of thinking. But Ibn is so fascinating, but he, much like the European Low Country medieval, the Beguines, and some of the people that I'll bring up in a second, talk about this sort of sense of annihilation of the self, the soul, and being consumed by God. And so, and for YouTube, I'm saying God in a colloquial sense that we can all recognize. And Marguerite Porret said the same thing in her book, Mirror of Simple Souls, which I bought a few weeks ago and I'm enjoying, that, the annihilation of the soul and being, again, consumed by God. So I say the soul in the sense of maybe the ego, just surrendering. And it's fascinating to me that in these different places and within 100 years or so, so I think Meister Eckhart was informed by Marguerite Porret, so there may be a correlation, to how he was presenting his mysticism and so forth.
If you go back to scholasticism and Sufism and the mysticism in Shiite Islam,
Mm-hmm.
Then it's much more recent stuff. Then it's more difficult to argue that there are just multiple origins that are similar just because people were looking at the same truth. Because by that time, there was so much commercial commerce and cultural commerce that it becomes impossible to argue for the purity of an idea. To argue for purity, as I do, you have to go at least 2,500, 3,000 years ago, maybe more if you go to Aboriginals, for instance, and you're talking about several thousands of years. So it's difficult to argue for this magical commonality arising independently in different places because so much what was going on, Europe and the Middle East were effectively a world, an integrated world. North Africa, the Middle East, and European lands. That was one world, and they even had commerce with the rest of China, the Far East. So I think what was happening there is that people were still having the original, pure, primary experiences, but they would then attach that to one of the running lines of discourse of the time, the one that would get closer to their own personal experience, and that would enrich those lines with the fresh, living reality of direct experience. But the experience would also sort of mold itself to that narrative, because that's the conceptual baggage and the cultural metaphors that the experiencer brought to bear on the experience,
Right.
if you know what I mean. So it's much more difficult to argue for the purity of those lines when you're talking about the 13th century. It's too recent.
Sure, and I totally agree. In fact, Hildegard von Bingen was tied to a Celtic monastery, and the Celts, she references red people, so which is of course not politically correct anymore, but New World inhabitants, first world culture of Native Americans, as well as the Eastern. I don't know if it was Buddhism or maybe a Vedanta or something, but she references in her works. Scholars point to that she was obviously influenced in this Celtic monastery by Eastern thought, much like Schopenhauer was introduced to Eastern thought.
And the philosophical streams coming from Egypt. I mean, with Alexander the Great, or as I prefer, Alexander the Drunken Hooligan,
Yeah.
Imagine if the Iranians would generalize like Sam Harris generalizes. We would all be drunken hooligans in the West, but they don't do that. Huh? Kudos to them. Well, maybe they do a little bit, but
yeah. Well, who wrote the history, right?
Yeah. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. That's why Alexandria, an Egyptian city, was called Alexandria, and the Library of Alexandria that was burned to tremendous loss. That was a Greek colony. So those ancient streams of Egyptian mysticism certainly influenced what we call Western occultism. The whole idea of Hermes Trismegistus and Western mysticism with the Rosicrucians in the 17th century, all the way to today, the Masonry. So there was a lot of commerce. It becomes very cloudy to try to discern purity in those philosophical lines. But they all, of course, will reflect their origins, and they reflect the continuous direct experiencing that gave those lines of philosophy a new life continuously. So they would be refueled by direct experience. But there would be this two-way commerce. The direct experience was informed by the myth, and the direct experience reinforced the myth. This only stopped very recently, and to some extent, the Catholic Church is to blame for that, because the Catholic Church explicitly tries to distance itself from direct experience. And although the liturgy of the Mass certainly has an origin in which the aim was to allow the people attending the Mass to have a direct experience, over the centuries, with the papacy become a major political force in Europe, together with the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which is now Germany, the church sort of explicitly deviated from the need to cultivate a direct experience and try to replace experience with dogma, with the argument that experience was unreliable. And dogma, because of the historical momentum that it has, was more reliable. So even Christian mystics, and you named several, von Bingen, Eckhart, they were marginalized in their time. There were questions of hereticism going around these people because they dared to have a religious experience. And I think that is responsible for the fact that religion, which in the West has been so molded by the Catholic Church, even Protestantism sort of is a splinter movement out of the Catholic Church because of the church's excesses. Because the Catholic Church so much framed Western religiosity, and by eliminating direct experience from it, it eliminated the source of life, the fuel for religious life. it stratified it. It turned it into a sort of stone statue, like I forgot his name. The wife, when they were in the Bible story, when they were leaving,
Oh yeah, I know.
she
I know what
turned
you're,
into a
a
salt
pillar,
statue.
salt. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know this.
So,
I don't know chapter and verse, but yeah, I know what you're saying. I know what
so
you're saying.
it was during the burning of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Hmm.
Was it Lot's wife? Yeah, I think so.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds right. I'm
But
not.
the church did that to religiosity, turned it into a salt statue. At the moment, it said it's all about the dogma and not about experience. And the mass, instead of an experience of religion, religare, to reconnect with God, it became a kind of trial. And in Protestantism, it is outright a trial because the Protestant preachers, they often dress like judges. And the church is modeled after a courtroom. And I think that although it served its original purpose, which was to maintain the power of the clergy, because now you needed the clergy, they were the intermediaries. It's through them that you would be handed over the truth, the dogma. You wouldn't have any direct access to it. It served that purpose back then to solidify the power, the political, temporal power of the clergy. But it had as an extremely pernicious, disastrous, catastrophic side effect the loss of life and energy in religious activity. So in the West, the religious activity has become dead. Who is going to go to the church to hit his chest 3 times and say, my fault, my fault, my
Yeah,
fault?
maximum
Or to
mea
be,
culpa.
yeah, or to be judged, or to be told everything you're doing wrong.
Yeah.
People don't go there anymore because it's not inspiring. The Mass, which was supposed to be liturgy of religare, of religion, reconnect, direct experience, it has
Rebinding.
lost that aspect. And religion has become fossilized. It's not even a shadow of what it was meant to be. It's not religion anymore. It has become a moral and political book, a rule book,
Mm-hmm.
very outdated one that people are still fighting over. So I would say, the Catholic Church has, in the West at least, has quite a bit of the share of the responsibility for religion having lost its source of energy, its vibrancy, its life, its aliveness, its fire.
Um, so this can open up a new line of conversation. But first of all, thank you for indulging me about going in the past, because we can go into sort of present moment conversation. And this is a question I did have for you, and you segued it beautifully. The regalia, the rebinding. We talked about it more recently than in the past, about how religion can be a vehicle or a conduit for this growth, this emergence of what you're doing. What does that look like? Do we look at a radical reformation of existing systems, or do we craft something from scratch? What are the options there in terms of regalia and the rebinding to the ineffable, ethically, responsibly, with with the effect that is the felt effect that can be had?
I don't know.
It's a simple question, Bernardo. three sentences or less. Sorry.
Look, my daimon is a very pragmatic daimon. It tells me what I need to do.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't tell me why or in what context it's going to play a role or when. I just know what I have to do, and the rest is not my problem, so to say. Which is a liberating thing. I mean, my daimon is a vicious one. If I don't do its bidding, I am in for a world of suffering, and physical ailment as well. But it lets me off the hook if I do its bidding, in the sense that it also lets me know, if you do it, you don't have to worry about anything else. It's not your problem. Whether your message will spread like fire around the world or will be known to only a couple of people, doesn't matter to me, because it's not my problem. So this is very liberating in a sense. It's the other side of the same coin of my daimon. So I don't have an answer for you. So I will speak now as just one more observer of the
Sure.
of the madness that is world culture today. I think it would be easiest if the church would just have the balls to reform itself
Mhm.
in order to be more conducive to religious fire, religious energy, and not allow that fire to become a monopoly of um, sorry, my mind is
It's okay.
I'm missing the names today. This gospel-oriented churches, which are very oriented towards direct experience, glossolalia and religious exaltation, and it has become a monopoly of these religious movements. But the church has an incomparably longer history. It has access to symbolism that is now very deeply implanted in the Western so-called quote unconscious, or the not metacognitive, non-associated consciousness, but I'll keep calling it unconscious to honor Jung. I don't mean it literally.
Right.
Those symbolism, those to use Jordan Peterson's phrase, those maps of meaning are very, very entrenched into the collective Western psyche. And it's naive of us to think that we are our own man, that we are not in any way related to this collective past, that we are sort of born in a vacuum. This is incredibly naive. We are riding a storm in an ocean that's much bigger than us. So the church has access to that. It has access to that symbolism. It has access to the buildings, to the paraphernalia, to the historical momentum. If the church would just have the balls to be a religious institution again, as opposed to a moral slash political institution,
Mhm.
which is what the papacy transformed it into around the 11th century, maybe even 10th century, then we would have the best chance, because this is relatively low hanging fruit. This stuff, that symbolism is so alive still in the Western collective unconscious, that tapping into it through the paths that have been laid out throughout history uh, would be fast and relatively easy. But the church still elects to only talk about morals, to talk about whether gays are allowed to have sex or not. I mean, this is this is catastrophic. It is
Yeah.
ridiculous. Where is religion? Religion is not morals. You can perhaps derive a moral code from religion, but that's just what it is, a derivative. Because the point is religion. Morality is a derivative, maybe an important one, but it's not the core. The
Yeah.
core is religare, to
Mhm.
reconnect.
Yeah.
So if the church would dare to be a religious institution again, I think that would be the most straightforward way out of this catastrophe that is spiritual life, not only in the West now, because our nihilistic virus has long ago engaged into a pandemic activity and has contaminated the whole world, even China, even Japan, even the East, even India.
Mhm.
Um, that would be the shortest way out. But I had hope about this some time ago. A few years ago, I was in the Vatican, um, and there was some hope. The new Pope, Pope Francis. Uh, no, I don't have that hope anymore. And
A
I
fizzled out
think,
reformer.
yeah, because the same enormous historical momentum that the church has going for it to be a major player in spiritual life today, that same momentum is what is keeping it shackled.
Yeah. And
And it's too irresistible a momentum for them to free themselves from it. It will probably have to first end and just become a museum, like it's already becoming throughout Europe. Churches are now touristic attractions. They are hardly places of true worship anymore. And whatever worship is still left, if you go there, you will see that most people are 60 plus. So yeah, I think it will die, and then we just hope that out of that stratified frozen museum that it will eventually become, that the phoenix will somehow reemerge from the ashes. But spiritual nurturing does require institutional support. We cannot do it on our own, separate from one another. Our psychology, I don't think, has the stamina in most cases, certainly not in my case, to do that. We need institutional support. We need a collective effort, a collective engagement in order to reconnect as a culture. Individuals who are spiritual but not religious are doing their best, but it's like swimming against a major Atlantic storm. You are not going to go in the direction you're swimming. Impersonal forces are much too powerful. We need that coherence and that psychological egregora of a collective, institutionally supported effort.
Centrality.
Yeah. So in
And
that sense, I'm very conservative.
right. And as a system, as a mechanism, it's an infrastructure already in place, and it makes absolute sense. And again, I'm deeply averse to organized religion for the sake of what you've mentioned, that it's bureaucracy, it is politics, it is morality, judgment calls, and so forth, and that has nothing to do with a transcendent unification or experience, as you said, a direct experience with whatever you want to call it. So whatever you want to call it, I don't see how that could function either.
Look, everything that humans do collectively is bound to be corrupted, because the tendency to corrupt is part of being human. It's part of our shadow. Only the cult of innocence that we engage in today tells us that it's not okay to be mature. It's not okay to recognize that corruption is in all of us in different ways. That we have to pretend that only the other guys are corrupt and that we are pure and we are all going to go to heaven. This cult of innocence, of course, it's time for it to go, because it serves no purpose. So any institution, including religious institution, is bound to be abused and corrupted. But you mentioned New Age and religion. We can go forward, and all political systems, all economical systems have been corrupted throughout history. There is not one thing that humans have engaged collectively in that has not been abused and corrupted in certain ways, which is not to say that those things didn't also serve a good purpose next to having been corrupted. And that's the point of maturity that I think we need to get to as a society. Everything is complex. If you find that there is a very bad aspect to something, don't throw away the baby with the bath water, because there may be a very important good aspect to that. The existence of the bad doesn't cancel out or deny the existence of the good. Now, the Christian or the Catholic Church has been single-handedly responsible for providing moral grounding for the greatest atrocities in the history of humanity. And we talk about the obvious ones, the burning of the witches, or the Crusades. Not only the Crusades against the Muslims, who were just having their lives there in peace, and then suddenly these thousands of Europeans show up cutting them to pieces. What the hell was that?
Yeah.
But also the Crusades, for instance, the Albigenses Crusade was against people in the south of France, who were killed just like Muslims. They were Christians, just a different form of Christianity.
Yeah.
So these are the obvious examples, but there are the less obvious ones. The Jesuits, in their ideological blindness of having to enforce Christianity in the New World, be it the Americas or Australia, both of which are continents, they drew out the meaning of the lives of entire civilizations, who descended into drunkenness and depression and poverty, because all their maps of meaning were stolen from them. And here we are not talking about hundreds of thousands. Here we are talking about many millions. And that was probably the greatest atrocity in the history of humanity. And it was just, I'm not saying that the church was responsible for it directly. I mean, Europeans would have invaded the Americans anyway and killed everyone anyway.
Yeah.
But they gave moral legitimacy to those activities. When the Pope wanted people to go on a crusade against the Muslims, the Pope wanted to consolidate power, because the Pope was losing temporal power, and the religious fervor surrounding a crusade was very handy for the Pope, the papacy as an institution. And too bad Muslims had to die for it, but it was not about them, if you know what I mean.
Well, they were the others at that point.
Yeah. And this kind of cynical moral embasement of atrocity the church is guilty of. And I'm saying all this because I want to recognize the darkness.
Mhm.
But the church is also responsible for whatever shred of reconnection we have had in the history of the West. It is the one, Christianity is the one myth that has gone really deep, that has passed, uh, that has overcome all of our defenses and barriers, and has lodged itself deep in the heart of Western people. Um, and there ought to be something good about that, because it would have been impossible for us to hold the civilization together for 2,000 years um, without some form of religious nurturing. We would not have had motivation to accomplish anything. I mean, let's talk about the Enlightenment in the 17th century. The beginning of science was religiously motivated. It was against the church, but it was religiously motivated. Early scientists were discovering the language of God. And arguably, without that, they wouldn't have had motivation to do it. So I think it's very important that we recognize the negative, but also recognize the positive, so we know what we have to get rid of and what we have to keep.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we will end up always with nothing.
Mhm. So reconciliation and then reformation, perhaps. But what is the catalyst? What is the key driver in that? And that's like you said, this is just Bernardo talking. This is me asking these kind of questions, and so the answers are non-binding in the sense that it's so contingent on so many things happening. And I'll bring another aspect in that you like, that you would appreciate. Maybe this is incoherent. I don't know, but in looking at our human history for just go back 15,000 years or so, or let's go back about 8 or 9, like pre-pottery, 8 or 9,000 years ago, and we bring in the archetypal roles of the base archetype of human expression. Is it even possible to transcend some of the, again, darker or more shadowy roles that are being played? Is this mind at large committed, and I'm using that term very loosely, it's not that there's an intention behind it, but is it, is there, so in other words, going forward indefinitely, are there going to be these roles being played and expressed and experienced by these experiential devices that are dark and shadowy? And so, in other words, can we even escape the gravity of archetypal characters or forms, if you will, or whatever it is, how you want to look at that? Is that something that, are we kidding ourselves when we think that we can elevate or maybe tone down the amount of suffering that we're going through?
I think it is possible. I think it's a battle we should not, or an evolutionary process that we should not underestimate, because these archetypal forces are impersonal, transpersonal, and they are hugely powerful. They are like volcanoes. You're not going to put your thumb on top of the volcano to try to stop an eruption. It's going to blow whether your thumb is on it or not. So we shouldn't underestimate what it takes, but I think it is ultimately possible. Jung thought it was possible through what he called individuation. And the process of individuation was the process of accepting the shadow, acknowledging that it has a right to exist, becoming explicitly aware of it, such that it doesn't come and bite you on your butt. Because that's how we lose it. We lose it through the cult of innocence, through this childish myth that there are the good people and there are the bad people, and that's all we need to know, and that the good people have nothing bad in them. One of these good people, when he hits 40, will take a gun and kill 12 people in a mall. That's the archetype, blowing up because its existence has never been recognized. It has never been integrated and acknowledged and dealt with in a healthy way that puts some boundaries around how that archetype can manifest itself. It comes back and bites you in the butt. So the way to deal with it is to be mature about it, is to acknowledge that these forces exist in each and every one of us, um, honor them, but not give them free rein, and keep them under watch, because you can only control what you are explicitly aware of. What you deny and tell yourself doesn't exist is out of control, and it will possess you. And that's the origin of the term possession. Because it's a quite good term. It's something in your mind that is rejected, unacknowledged, is never nurtured, it's never observed. One day it explodes like a volcano, and then you are possessed by the devil, and you will act accordingly. So I think it's very difficult, but I think it is ultimately possible, and I think it is ultimately our responsibility. We are the metacognitive aspect of nature. We are the only game in town as far as being able to pass moral judgment, because to pass moral judgment, you need to not only experience, but you need to know that you are experiencing these things so you can judge them. So you can take a sort of pseudo objective position, such that you are not the evil, you are the one that felt evil impulses. And this distinction, you're not the evil, you are the subject who felt evil impulses. That distinction is crucial for moral judgment. Without that distinction, you cannot pass moral judgment. And that distinction is only possible through metacognition. And we are the only game in town as far as metacognition. So I think our service to God, if I can speak metaphorically, is to be the metacognitive spies of God, to be the part of God that looks back at itself and say, that there is not okay. That we should control. And without us, it's all instinct manifesting all its potentialities. Things will continue to go like that. Elephants being eaten alive for 6 hours by a pride of lions before it even passes out. It's not only us, tragedy and catastrophe occurs throughout nature. The dinosaurs, I mean, the examples are countless. So I think the responsibility lies, even the divine responsibility in an indirect way, lies squarely upon us. The moral responsibility is ours. And we are not going to fulfill this responsibility by continuing on with the cult of innocence, like Jim Hillman used to say.
When I put my rose-colored glasses on and I get optimistic, which I try to stay neutral, I try to be either pessimistic or optimistic. But when I do put my rose-colored glasses on, one thing that I like to either say to myself, or if I'm in conversation with somebody and going over all this kind of stuff, is that we can mitigate a great deal of our suffering through what we've been talking about and what Essentia is doing, what others are doing, and that's something I want to get to in a little bit. But to downplay our own self-inflicted, self-induced, self-manufactured suffering, and let nature create suffering. So people are going to get struck by lightning, tornadoes are going to destroy communities, earthquakes, tsunamis, on and on and on. There is that level, but that is more of a default process that we certainly don't have any executive faculty or capability, but we do have. Go ahead, sorry.
Do you think we should eliminate suffering? I don't think.
No. I'm not going there. I'm just saying that nature can give us all the suffering, and mourning the loss. Like when that tsunami hit Southeast Asia and 200 and some odd thousand people perished. You have to go through that as a human being, as somebody who lost your family if you survived, or the Fukushima tsunami.
Yeah, but even then, even self-created suffering. At least my experience has been that only when I'm suffering, I achieve new insights, because suffering is that thing that stops me on my tracks and forces me to think and introspect and self-reflect. If I'm not suffering, I'm just riding the fantastic wave of life, and I'm not stopping to think. There is this series, my girlfriend likes to watch it, and I watched a couple of episodes with her, about the devil who is in Los Angeles. It's a Netflix series.
Okay.
So the devil sort of comes to Earth, and he's a club owner, and he ends up helping the police solve crimes. And then there are some demons that are friends of that devil. But the interesting thing about that show is that the devil is portrayed as the good guy, while he actually plays the devil. He's the Punisher.
Much like what Satan was in the Torah and in
Oh yeah.
Gnosticism. I mean, the devil in the Garden of Eden, he was the good guy. You know?
Yeah, you don't even need to go that far back. I mean, in the Old Testament, the devil was just the prosecutor in the court
Yeah,
of God.
exactly.
He did God's bidding.
Yeah, which just
and
just reminded me when you said that.
Yeah,
He's not what he's made out to be.
read the book of Job. I mean,
right, exactly.
Yeah. And
So
in that series, the devil is portrayed as a guy who nobody likes because he doesn't let you get away with your own bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
He's the guy who confronts you and says, you know, what do you really want? You know, why did you really do that? You know, he's the guy who makes your shadow side clear to you. It cuts through your hypocrisy. Mm-hmm. The devil is the character in the series that cuts through your hypocrisy. It puts a mirror in front of you and confronts you with all the things about yourself that you don't want to be confronted with, that you don't want to acknowledge, that you don't want to know. And in the series, the devil is incapable of lying because he's plays so much that role of, you know, the truth of the matter, what your real shadow really is, what you really want, what really motivates you, your hypocrisy, your bullshit, your narratives, you know, cutting through all that nonsense. And I thought that series is great because it portrays the devil as the devil used to be.
Yeah, exactly. and I think the Hebrew devil came and made, I don't know if that cart horse on this one, but Radamanth and Radamanthine. I love that term, Radamanthine. And it's actually changed a little bit. Like I used to collect dictionaries. And so I had dictionaries from the 50s and the 60s. And so Radamanthine then meant just unwaveringly just. And now it's more like a cynical prosecutorial character or somebody who is just very by the book. Yeah.
The point I wanted to make, Justin, is that insofar as we associate the devil with suffering, no, suffering is what happens in hell under the eyes of the devil.
Yeah.
What suffering does is exactly that. It confronts you with your own bullshit. Mm-hmm. It cuts through your bullshit narratives. It cuts through your hypocrisy. It puts a mirror in front of you. Yeah. You see that so often. People who get a terminal diagnosis and are coming close to the end and they start thinking, I screwed up all my relationships. I alienated people. I was so arrogant. I was so selfish. Do you think they would have these insights if suffering hadn't been imposed upon them? Of course not.
Right.
So suffering equals the devil equals cutting through our bullshit and confronting us with the reality of ourselves. So in that sense, I think we need the devil. We need suffering. I think what we need to do is to try to eliminate redundant suffering, excessive suffering that is no longer leading anywhere. Like if somebody is dealing with depression for a decade, you know, you've had all insights you could possibly have milked out of that. You continue in that now because it has become an automatism. It has become a mental habit that the mind is very prone to, and it's very difficult to break away from. It's a kind of addiction. It's one of the forms in which the energy of addiction manifests itself. So we had to rein in against that kind of superfluous, redundant, unnecessary suffering. But I would say, you know, if you get rid of all suffering, if you get rid of the devil, then you are left with Yahweh. And look at what Yahweh did to Job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so let me articulate when I had the rose-colored glasses on a few minutes ago. So I'm looking, now that you've said what you said, I'm looking at 3 levels here. So there's nature, you know, trees falling on your head, killing you, lightning strikes, tsunamis, whatever. Then there is that personal level, the local level of suffering. And I totally agree with you. Suffering is our master, it is our teacher. And I believe that since I was in my early 20s when I first found out what's up, well, teenager, and, you know, try to reconcile and make sense of it. But what I'm talking about is a meso level of the collectives, of the species itself, the humanity going to war, persecuting racial things, which, you know, racial is a loaded term. It doesn't, you know, cultural, ethnic, ethnocentrism, all this kind of stuff, all the bullshit on a collective level that just piles up and we drown in bullshit. And so that's where I'm coming from. It's not so much, I think I completely agree with you that we need that driver. We need, because like you said, otherwise we'd be sitting in a hammock and nothing would happen. And the mind at large would, blow the place up. It would end, right? Because we're not doing anything. We're all resting on our laurels. So no, I completely agree with you. But do you see my point though, that as a societal, as a social species, we can get our act together, get our shit together enough to stop this social suffering, this mesos layer of suffering that would free things up for as much well-being, as much thriving as is possible.
To comment a little on that, I think to speak of a theme that's very dear to Essentia Foundation, very dear to the founder of Essentia Foundation, Fred Matzer, competition is driving us insane, and it's an artificial drive. I was born in 1974, so I was born the year that Federico Fagin founded Zilog, the early days of the microprocessor, of home computing technology, automation, and I am from that generation. I was born at that time. I saw the birth of the commercial internet in 1993. I was 19 years old. So all this cycle of automation sort of goes hand in hand with not only the period of my life, but the themes of my life. I am a computer engineer next to being a philosopher. And in the early days, I remember we had this notion, which was very well substantiated, very reasonable and plausible, that automation would free us up to have philosophical or artistic lives, that nobody would need to labor away like a machine for 70 hours, 75 hours a week for $8 or $9 an hour, like a mechanical piece of an engine. That would be a thing of the past. And technology-wise, we've achieved all that. I mean, we've achieved the robotics, the artificial intelligence, which is a real thing. We've achieved the automation, the computer, software, and hardware that's needed to do all that. We've automated so much of labor, but we still work more than we worked back then. So what happened? And I tell you what happened. And what happened is that the measure of success is no longer how good our lives are. The measure of success is now how much better our life is compared to the other guy. And that game can never stop. It doesn't matter how good your life is, somebody's life is better. And that is the engine. So now China, who was in the early days of my life, was a largely agrarian state still, has modernized itself. So did India. So now they want to have the same insane pattern of living that Americans and Western Europeans, mainly Americans, I'm not going to whitewash this, mainly Americans, that standard of living, of burning enormous amounts of fuel to move around in Humvees or SUVs that look like Humvees, or spending electricity. Yeah, I mean, the amount of energy spent, the amount of waste produced by an average American life, even a Western European life, but I've seen the numbers in the US, it's a lot worse. If now everybody wants to have that, then we will continue to work 80 hours a week, because it's a moving target and it's an unrealistic, implausible, and unsustainable target. So we did this to ourselves because of our drive for competition. We could be having artistic, philosophical lives right now because we have automated enough to achieve that goal. But yeah, we are still reproducing quite fast, although declining rates, but we are still increasing our amounts on the planet to levels that now you have to start wondering, do we have the technology to sustain this? Probably we do. Probably most of that is automated. Very few people working in agriculture. Agriculture is almost completely automated. So it's not like we need to work hard to put food on our plates with 11 billion of us on the surface of this planet. It's not the case. We have the science, we have the technology, we can do it. But we keep grasping because of competition and comparisons. I mean, Fred Matzer, the founder of Essentia Foundation, he says, let's compare with care in order to share with care. And that's he repeats this all the time. It's an interesting idea. We could all be having good lives, but we do this shit to ourselves. I mean, we achieved the technology and the science that we dreamed of back in the late 70s and early 80s to have these leisure lives of philosophy and art and insight and love and learning, but we still work 80 hours a week. And we've done that to ourselves. We had the means to not allow it to happen, and we not only allowed it to happen, we went for it. Yeah, that's not sensible. One you already identified, the materialist metaphysics leads to materialist ethics. In other words, the only possible meaning of life is to accumulate material objects because nothing else survives. Everything else is ephemeral, it's transitory. Consciousness is transitory. Insight, learning, love is all transitory. When you die, it all disappears. Only matter remains. So you have to accumulate material goods. There is no other possible meaning in life. And then you enter into a kind of rat race. It's never enough. Yeah. The other factor is we have lost our ability to live by proxy because we are now so fundamentally dissociated from one another, also because of the materialist metaphysics that informs how we feel about each other, that we no longer can live the good life by proxy. I mean, hundreds of years ago, in the Middle Ages in Europe, there was a king who had the life, who lived in a palace with his family, who ate the best foods, who lived in luxury. He had the great life at the expense of everybody else. Why do you think such a system arose? Is it merely because, you know, the power struggles, that one person happens to be in control of the weapons? Yes, that all played a big role. But there was another more subtle, but I think equally important role. People had the ability to live by proxy. So even though they were miserable and they were sweating every day to act a mild, not even a decent living, they knew there was that king in that castle that gave birth to all of that mythology in their own minds. And they lived that by proxy. The king had that life. So in a sense, they all had too, because they were aware of it. They could see it. There was a sharing of that. Today, we are completely unable to do that. If you watch, there was a program, when I was younger, there was a program on MTV called Crips, which showed the house of famous people.
Right.
What people do now, instead of that satisfying their longing for that and saying, well, my little studio is okay. No, it has the opposite effect. Everybody wants to have that crib.
Yeah. Checklist, so, right?
Yeah.
Two Lamborghinis, 15 jet skis.
Because they have it, now I want to have it too. Otherwise, it means nothing to me that he's having that life if I am not. Well, in the hundreds of years ago, it was not quite that. We were more attuned to our shared humanity. That one human that had that meant that all humans had that in a certain way. Now that psychology has completely reversed now, and yeah, we will. This will never end. We will suck this planet dry, then die, and well, hopefully we'll find a different way out of this.
And that's what these conversations are about. And I don't know if it was you or somebody else that you're talking about needs and serfs and so forth. And ironically, they had a lot more leisure time than we do. So even though they were wretchedly poor and they didn't eat well and they didn't live long, but they had more leisure time. And they probably dedicated that to the church, but still. Sorry.
I was born in Brazil. So when I was a kid, I had Brazilian history. Most of it was European history, but there was a little bit of Brazilian history. I was a kid, I don't know, 10, 9, early grades. And something was told to me back then that I never forgot, because I thought that was so amazing an insight. Even as a kid, I could already relate to that. The teacher said, when we Portuguese came here, I'm half Portuguese. We needed people to work the fields because we wanted to produce sugarcane to export to Europe, and so the king of Portugal would be rich. So we needed people to work the fields of sugarcane. You know, harvesting sugarcane is back-breaking work. It requires a lot of people to work for you. So the Portuguese figured, let's enslave the Indians. They are already here. There are 6 million of them, abundant. We enslave them, we chain them up, and we tell them, go cut the sugarcane. And what they discovered to their surprise is that the Indians would just die. They wouldn't rebel, they wouldn't revolt, they would just die slowly. So, and that's why slavery became a thing in Brazil. They figured that the Africans didn't die. So they went to Africa to pick up human beings as if they were animals and bring them to Brazil because the Africans were psychologically more resilient, which is not surprising to me, that psychological resilience. You can see that still today. But it's a blessing that worked terribly for them. It worked out terribly. Their psychological resilience was precisely what enslaved them. And then I started looking, well, but why did the Indians die? And then the teacher explained, they are hunter-gatherer society. They will hunt and gather stuff for a couple of hours a day. The rest of the day, they lie around in hammocks, they tell stories, they have sex. They live the life.
Yeah.
You know? And then when you chain them up and you say, you're going to work 16 hours a day, they just die.
Yeah.
They just die. So yes, it's a fiction. Now look, all this technology, all this automation, all this robotics, all this AI, and we work a lot harder than a primitive Brazilian Indian of the 16th century.
Yeah.
It is unbelievable.
Yep. And I
have to have a metaphysical narrative endorsed by the culture that creates space for meaning, such that we can attach to it with our own private inner lives, attach to it and sort of join a larger cultural movement, so to say. It is the isolation of meaning making that makes it ineffective. If our mainstream metaphysical narrative created at least open space for it, that we could latch onto, and therefore sort of join together in that adventure of unveiling meaning, I think it would happen very naturally. And that's one of my key motivations for trying to change that mainstream cultural narrative. Or the first and main motivation is that, well, it's obviously wrong. Whatever the right is, then the one we have today is demonstrably wrong. So truth alone is enough reason to change it. But it so happens that an alternative could open space for meaning that the current one doesn't. And that could really change our relationship with ourselves and each other and the world.
I'll say that another thing that keeps me from kind of giving up hope, and I'm not so much into generations and ages and things like that, but I will say that I'll cut off, and I've done this before in other conversations, that around the age 40 and below, younger, and we can call them millennials and Gen Z or whatever you want to call them, but just there are segments within that population, I think, that get it. And you've pointed to this, you had a young man on last year and you were talking to him, and he was a millennial, and you know, you expressed your enthusiasm for what they're doing, and you expressed a sort of positive outlook on how they are rejecting this horseshit, lifestyle that, and it's not, again, it's not generational, because there are segments in each population. Like there are boomers out there who've done some incredible things. You and I are Gen Xers, and we're here as living examples of how do we move forward in to produce a brighter future for humanity, kind of thing. In other words, you mentioned coming up with the advent of efficient microprocessors that can be scaled down. And I was born in 1969, so whatever, I'm the moon landing guy, and so, the generation that was born in the early to mid 80s had to come up, with video games and with either really super strict parental oversight, helicoptering and things like that, or social media, which just, you're imprinted, right? You're brought up differently. So I'm not saying any of this in judgment, but I do see it as being something that I hope can be reconciled, that it's recognized in that generation, because that's the only thing I see standing in the way of them, really pushing forward and making this change happen. To I guess get to a point, is that that generation holds the keys, and I think they have potential beyond. And we can help. Yeah, we can help people like, who are of that mindset that want to facilitate change can be there as
Yeah.
helpful actors.
They are at the same time that they are vulnerable to certain kinds of bullshit. In other ways, they are surprisingly capable of not latching onto bullshit.
Yeah.
And there is a certain autonomy in that generation that ours didn't have. So yeah, I am hopeful. I don't think materialism as a metaphysics can survive the millennial generation occupying key posts in academia.
Yeah, yeah, and let's hope. How you doing on time? I want to check in with you.
It's quite late. We have been doing this for 3 hours.
Have we now? Okay. Do you want? I can stop and
we can begin to wrap up.
Yeah, let's do that. So, oh, it just went out of my head what I wanted to. Okay, this is how we can wrap up. I think this is a good way. Now, I mentioned Vervaeke a couple of times, and I really enjoyed that. What was it? The theolocution you had. Such an elegant word. It brings to mind that Bernardo and Idealism and Essentia Foundation exist in an environment where there could be competing ontologies or metaphysics, but at the same time, as what the big takeaway I got from that 7 hours of you guys talking was, and exchanging ideas and debating to some extent, was there was this recognition of, it doesn't have to be solidarity per se, but it is a agreement to recognize the problems. And is there room for a cooperative movement? Do you see there being cooperative outreach and things like that in the future, with the right actors, the right players, for the sake of the bigger picture?
Is there room for cooperation? Of course, a lot of what humans do. Humans are the cooperating species. That's what differentiates us from other species. We can cooperate at very large scales with people we don't know nothing about. You don't get that with other primates. You don't get that with whales. They cooperate amongst people they know, but not at a large scale with strangers. And humans create these little fictions that, like money, that enable them to cooperate. I mean, Harari wrote extensively about this in his very famous book. So yeah, of course, there is room for cooperation. What you will never see from me is a willingness to compromise on content in order to strike politically convenient alliances. That I will never do. I will never say, yeah, okay, maybe dissociation is not what is really going on, and I will concede that even though I don't believe it. I think dissociation is exactly the right answer for the decomposition problem, but then I concede that so I can be friends with another philosopher. So no, that I don't believe in. I am too committed to what I think to be the best guess answer to the truth in order to compromise on content for the sake of alliances of convenience. You will never see this from me. This is beyond me. It's not even a choice. It's a realization of how I'm put together. I am structurally and psychologically unable to do this.
Yeah, and I'm not asking for kumbaya and synergy in the sense that it goes to the root. So it goes to the metaphysics and to the ontological foundation. That's, I understand that. And in fact, Vervaeke and Matt Segal were talking about your decomposition solution or your proposal by way of the dissociative analogy, and they just kind of talked about it dismissively and then moved on, but there was nothing there as an alt. So I know that that's just going to be a continuing, ongoing thing, and they will have their assets and their ideas that they want to work with, and that's fine. But no, like I'm saying, on a larger scale, larger picture, and it doesn't have to be Ascension, it doesn't have to be Bernardo Kastrup. It's sort of kind of like an analogy would be how Protestantism has so many divisions and so many sects, right? There's all kinds of different types of Protestant or Reformation of Christianity, and there is outreach in these groups to try to just forward whatever it is their agenda is and their messages. And I know for a fact, going again back to Whitehead, that people like Segal, you know, they're in line with you in terms of you know, physicalism is untenable. It's absurd at this point, and you know, it's anyway, I just say that this is a good way to wrap it up. And the spirit of what you and Vervaeke did the other day, a couple weeks ago.
It was a dialogue. It was not neither me nor him compromised on content.
Yeah.
We had a dialogue, an attempt to understand each other mutually. I think there's a lot of room for that, but I don't think we should play politics with truth. The truth is whatever it is. We may not know it, but that doesn't make it different than what it is. I don't see an attempt to get to the truth as a political movement or something that would justify the construction of alliances of convenience. I am too focused on content in order to even contemplate. I'm not trying to found a religion. I'm not trying to found a new ism. I even use the old word idealism because I think it's perfectly appropriate. Why this cosmopsychism shit that people put forward in academia today to pretend that they are saying something that wasn't said before? This stuff has been said for 3,500 years. So I'm not interested in slogans, in campaign rallies, in political alliances, in trying to find common denominators. I'm not interested in any of that. This is all extremely abstract for me. I just don't have any interest in it. I am interested in argument, evidence, and the best narrative we can construct to try to capture what's going on. And in that sense, I am completely uncompromising, not because I am by character uncompromising, but because what I am interested in is the truth. I'm not interested in becoming famous or becoming important, of going to history. Be very honest with you, on the contrary, this is one of the unwelcome things about what my diamond forces me to do, is that I have to be more or less a public figure. It's not in my character. So I will say what I have to say. I will share my thoughts. I will try to understand others. I hope others try to understand me. I'll do my best to make myself understood. But then that's it. I have no further ambition to start an institution or a club or a political movement and chant rallies chant slogans at political rallies or rallies of any form. I'm not interested at all in any of that. I have something to say. Take it for what it's worth. If you don't agree, fine. If you agree, great. Either way, I'm having a good life right now.
Yeah.
Which is what I personally, Bernardo, as the person who is an illusion, but the person cares about that. Everything else is diamond's dance. And the diamonds is interested in saying certain things, understanding certain things, and sharing them for what they are worth. Nothing else is required of me. When I wrote my first book, I tried to write it under a pseudonym. But my publisher said that we will not do it because then you cannot give interviews. And now we are in the world, it was already, no, it was 2010, 2009 or 10. And there was already this blogosphere and podcasts and, you know, and they figured you cannot promote your book if you write it anonymously. But if I would have it my way, I would be penning my books under a different name to this day, and we would be having an audio conversation, not a video one.
And I know people who do that.
I'm not interested in any of what you just described, which may be bad, may be wrong, I don't know.
No,
but it is how I feel.
Yeah, it's you. And that's why I asked the question, because here's my motive in asking that question. You're either Essentia or Bernardo are working against some really strong gravitational forces. And so to create another analogy, a rabbi, an imam, and it sounds like a bad joke, and a priest can get together and say, we need to stop, setting people on fire in a particular region of the world because they don't accept something, and they all kind of agree, even though their theologies may be different, their belief systems may be somewhat disparate, although they're all Abrahamic. So we could bring a Hindu in for the sake of variety or whatever. But they, despite their backgrounds, so I'm not going to ask you the question anymore. You made your statement, but that's the point that I was trying to make, is that there are people who can come from either competing or disparate beliefs and so forth, and put aside certain things and go fight about it on the side in a salon with a good bottle of wine or something, and that's absolutely necessary. But and this isn't something I'm asking of you, but I think in order for this to actualize and to be realized, this change, that there's going to have to be cooperative outreach, not with you, of course, but just people in general who may come from different, I hate the word convictions, but beliefs about things, and working together to create change. And again, I'm not laying that on you, but I'm just saying, now that you've answered.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying.
There's a huge fucking tide that has to be turned, and it's like, how do you do it? Yeah, this is how I'm wrapping up this show. It's like, holy crap, we've got a huge weight, off to get off. Where we are. I mean, in other words, humanity, the plane is just about to strike the mountain. And you've even pointed out to this before, and I love what you say, that the first world, the mechanical, industrial, computer age world can go straight to hell. And people in Micronesia and people in the Austral-Asian chains who are living as primitives, people in the Kalahari and what's left of the Amazon will continue on as they have for 50,000 years, and they won't miss it, and they will be fine because they're so connected with nature that as long as we don't irradiate the planet, everything will be fine. So what I'm concerned about is I happen to occupy that so-called advanced technological Western space, and so yeah, that's a concern. Is we are on a crash course, I think, an existential, coming to a head.
I understand you, Justin, and look, we need leaders that will take the reins and change the direction of this Titanic that is heading to an enormous iceberg. And it will sink if those leaders don't rise up to the challenge and actually do things and implement the changes and be the changes. And there are many people, even in recent history, that I think had qualities of leadership that boggle my mind. To speak about the US, the leaders of the civil rights movement in the US in the 60s, again, it goes back to the psychological resilience of the original Black culture, which I don't want to sound too mushy, but I regard with reverence. I have profound admiration. I think even if I were a Black person in the US today, after the relative success of the civil rights movement in the 60s, so even today, which is better than it used to be, I think I would descend into drunkenness and die. I don't think I would have the psychological resilience to live under the conditions that Black people in certain parts of the world have to live through today. So I hope I'm not sounding too mushy, but I do have admiration for that. And I have even more admiration for their leaders. But I am not one of them. I don't have that resilience. I am not a leader of that kind. You may want to attach the word leader on me in the sense of a thought leader, but even that, it's like, is this really appropriate? Because all I'm doing is I'm re-explaining something that has been explained in different ways for 3,500 years. What kind of leadership is that? Know what I mean? But you could say, well, the way you use language, your metaphors and your rigor and the mode of reasoning that you use, it's all very recent and fits with the value system of the post-enlightenment culture. Yeah, okay. You may want to use the word leader for me, but even then I'm like, yeah, I'm not that kind of guy. Look, I am one step removed from being the guy who buys a chalet in the Swiss Alps and disappears from public life. And we wake up every day to admire the sunrise and the sunset and think and read and build little computers like I still do to this day. They're all freely available online for anybody to do. I'm one step removed from a life of almost complete disengagement from the throes of civilization and culture. One short step removed from that. And I live with the tension of being one step removed from that, but being pushed by my daemon to play a public role. So it's not like I am disgruntled, but it would take very little from my daemon for me to just say, okay, I did what I had to do, now I'm disappearing. So I am that kind of person. I am not a Martin Luther King. I can only look in awe with my jaw dropped at the resilience and the initiative or a Gandhi. My jaw drops at them. To me, they are, no, I don't want to sound too much mushy, but I have admiration for that, especially when these are people coming from situations of what today we call unprivileged situation, which is our clean code for people who are abused. Unprivileged conditions, that leadership can emerge from those conditions that would just crush me psychologically very quickly. I only have admiration for that, and which reinforces my own self-knowledge, my awareness of what I can and what I can't. That I can't.
Yeah.
I just don't have the psychological resilience, what it takes to play that kind of role. So people shouldn't expect that from me. What they should expect then from me is a message, a story, a argument, an expression of reason. And I would tell that story to anybody who wants to hear. And my work ends there.
Yeah.
I'm not going to pick up a banner and lead a revolution, although revolutions are needed. I am not the guy who do that. When I was in the corporate world, um, at very young age, 33, I was a director, which in the US would be a vice president. And there is this difference in titles.
Okay.
And it satisfied my ego. I still had a strong ego when I was 33. Um, but if I were to tell you what I disliked most about my job, it was to tell other people what they had to do, because I expect that people will know what they have to do, if you know what I mean. So I'm not going to tell anybody what to do. I'm just going to share my assessment of the situation, what I think is actually going on, what I think we are doing wrong. Beyond that, I hope the true leaders emerge.
You said in the beginning of the conversation that you didn't want or perhaps appreciate projection, and so please know that what I said earlier is not a form of projection. It is more
No, I know, no. I'm
right.
saying this for your audience.
Yeah, that too, because, and that brings up a good point, and I know we're getting into time here. Your last interview with the unfinished Cubby, the young man from Australia, he was kind of like, he was just really starstruck by you. He was awestruck by it. I thought it was really charming in a way. But it is a phenomena that occurs. And so as you have been sort of foisted into the public figure role by just being, again, following your daimon, following the flow of what needs to be said by you through, by the daimon through you, there are after effects or repercussions that occur in that. And I think one of the things that happens as you become this sort of public or quasi-public figure is that these things are foisted upon you. And I don't think there's any escaping that, Bernardo. I really don't. And I know you can work diligently to moderate that or modulate it.
Look, I have accepted it. I have accepted that reality. It was not an easy process of acceptance. I did that kicking and screaming. I told you, if I don't do my diamond's bidding, I will even be physically ill. Well, that happened. The public didn't see that. This was the prelude to the Bernardo Kastrup you guys know today. But I have come to a point where I accept this. This is something I have to do. But I have some degree of clarity about what the role is that I have to play and what the role isn't, until how far I have to go and from what point I no longer need to go. And those places where my diamond says, from this point on, you don't need to go, I'm not going there because it's not my nature, if you know what I mean. As I told you, I am one step removed from being a recluse and a very happy one. If I accept to become a receptacle of projections, I'll be working against my own message. So I shall never accept that. I will go to great lengths to prevent people from regarding me as anything more than the next confused human being. Now, having said that, look, my life is no longer nihilistic. I don't live under nihilism. I look around and my world has inherent meaning everywhere I look. I'm not in that kind of shitty position anymore. And it cost me a lot of suffering because only suffering sort of makes you stop and think. But I'm not there. I got to a point today in which I'm quite content with my personal life, how it's going. Um, it's a life full of meaning. There is still pain. There is still suffering, less than there used to be. I love my relationship. My partner who lives here with me. We're basically married, not just formally married. I love my cats, my home. I love to go for walks. I love to travel, go to Switzerland, to Germany. So I'm pretty content. I'm not suffering from the use of nihilism and materialism and lack of spiritual aspects to life. No, no, my world is full of depth, meaning, mystery. So from a purely egocentric point of view, the best thing to do is to be a recluse, because you know I'm not in that pit anymore. So, if others are, it's their problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I got out of it. So I just enjoy now. That would be my self-centered attitude. And I tell you, it's tempting. It's always there. It's like, why am I going through this insanity?
Yeah.
Having to engage in debate with people who didn't even begin to notice what's going on with them. But why? Why do I have to do this? This aggravation. I mean, I'm happy. I'm okay. My life has meaning, has depth, has mystery, has love, has everything.
Yeah.
But it is the bloody diamond. It is the bloody diamond goes, I cannot, for the life of me, accept that because I got out of that crap, and it's pretty deep crap,
Yeah.
a lot of suffering. I cannot, for the life of me, be happy if I know that there are billions of people out there still in that place. I can't be happy, especially because you've already made a kind of transition that you now know it's not difficult. It doesn't require superhuman powers. Otherwise, I wouldn't have made it. It's fairly simple if you just stop and think about it with a proper objective mind. If you examine your hidden assumptions and you think about it for a moment, you realize in a very irresistible way that life has a perennial dimension of depth, meaning, and mystery. So I cannot just sit idle and go to my Swiss chalet and pretend that other people are not going through tremendous and unnecessary suffering because they're living a narrative about what's going on with them that is just not true.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the motivation, and it is an irresistible motivation. It's a motivation that there is nothing you can do against it. I call it the diamond because it seems so transpersonal, so powerful that it's not a choice I make. It's like a choice made for me and imposed on me. That's why the metaphor of the diamond. But if tomorrow somebody slipped a pill into my drink that would remove my capacity to feel empathy for others and to care about the lot of others, make no mistake, the day after I would be in my Swiss chalet and you would never find out what my email address is
Yeah.
or my website. I
Gone.
would vanish. I would disappear from history. You would
Yeah.
need a very good detective to dig me out of my mountainside.
It's extremely tempting. However, it is there is a utility in what you're doing and what others are doing. And as you said, if the empathy switch was turned off, I think, yeah, you would have a good excuse not to do it because it is not pleasant. It's not. But I think in the sense of, let's just say you're flowing with your daimon, and I like to think of that as a flow state, almost like the Taoist kind of thinking. When you cooperate with the force, that drive inside of you that doesn't fit your ego's narrative of what you want, right? And I've been bitten by that too. I nearly killed myself about 10 years ago because I was in a very toxic stew of anger because I had a really shitty childhood and I tried to be successful. I've owned 4 businesses and they've all succeeded to a relative degree. Nothing failed, but I wasn't satisfied. I didn't do enough and I didn't succeed enough. And I just became very bitter and resentful and I almost killed myself, right? I almost died, not intentionally, just by illness. And it woke my ass up. And I said, okay, what now? And so then I started asking questions, big questions. And I find people like you and I say, okay, so that's my meaning making machine. And so if there is a daimon here, pushing me, then I've accepted that, because my life, and I don't want to be taken the wrong way, my life has no meaning beyond it now. My life,
Yeah.
I could go drive a truck, because I currently own a business, and I have another quote unquote business, which is more like a project, which is related to what we're doing here. And I want that to succeed. I'm going to do everything in my power to make it succeed. But if it doesn't work, I'll go get a job. I haven't had a job in 20 something years. I've always been self-employed. I've owned a restaurant, I've owned a newsstand, I've owned landscaping businesses. I only know self-employment and business ownership. But I'll say F it all, and I'll go drive a truck. So I'm going to spend a few years trying to make this happen and see if I can connect and do some good. And if it doesn't work, I'm fine. I'm good with that.
Yeah, that's exactly my deal with my diamond. I will do the bidding, but I am not responsible for the outcome. In other words, if it works, great. If it doesn't work, not my problem.
Yeah.
And this is how I actually experience this process. I don't experience responsibility for the result. I only experience responsibility for the contribution I have to make. The result is out of my hands. There is a sense I care, because empathy comes with the territory. Once you have certain insight, you cannot escape from empathy anymore, because you know you are the other guy.
Yeah.
And you know that in a very, very palpable, not an abstract conceptual sense, but in a very palpable, very present, concrete sense, you are everybody who is suffering. So empathy comes with the territory. You cannot separate the insight from empathy, in a certain sense, unfortunately. In another bigger sense, fortunately. So the empathy is there, but I can reconcile that with not feeling responsible for the outcome. Because who am I to feel responsible for the outcome? I am one person.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? How can I possibly feel responsible for the outcome of a civilization level process? No, it's insane to consider myself responsible for that. So I don't. And I can reconcile that with my feeling of empathy. So my empathy would say, if we are not successful, people will suffer, and I will feel that suffering. But at the same time, if we are not successful, it wasn't my problem. I will not feel guilty about it. That's the key difference. I will feel the empathy and I will co-suffer, but I will not feel guilty for it, so long as I have done my part. I'm not responsible for the outcome.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And if you want an outside perspective, I'd say in the last 10 years, you've done a hell of a lot more than most people. And I don't say that in judgment. I say that in just raw information, things that are in front of us and present in your work. And so, but that's not to say that you should rest on that, but that you've done well, and you've created a metaphysic. Well, again, I like the analogy that the deck already existed. You move the deck around and you present the cards in a really good way that people can say, oh, I get that. I see this. I understand it. Salience or relevance. And so you thus far have accomplished a lot more than the average person. And I think, in a sense of compromise between complete hermitage in the Alps and being this activist, if you will, and that's a bad choice of word, but I go that to the other extreme, that there is a healthy compromise. Like, I'm all about that spectrum, right? And the dials, and polarity. And so we're not looking at the poles. But I think, if I could, as an acquaintance and somebody who admires your work, and somebody I've had some great conversation with, I think, there is a happy middle ground where the daimon is satisfied. Bernardo has some sovereignty, some sense of agency that is safe from what most public figures and celebrities are exposed to. I feel so bad for people who are put into that position of being out in the spotlight. I think it's terrible.
Yeah, and look, the future is promising for me, because what I'm doing now with Essentia Foundation, it's not about me at all. If you go to Essentia's website, you will find a small photo of me with my name in one place and one place only.
Yeah.
You will find photos of other people in multiple places, names of other people in multiple places. So Essentia Foundation, well, now we published the course, Analytic Idealism, and I'm the one giving that course.
Yep.
So, okay, there is something now. But my work at Essentia Foundation is not about my ideas. It's about other people's ideas and how do we promote those ideas as well. And we needed to do the course to give some initial foundation to justify our right to exist, so to say. That's why that course is given by me. And I will not say this with any implied arrogance. There is no arrogance in what I'm about to say. At this point, nobody else could have given that course. It's just a fact. It's not because I'm better. I just happen to be in a place that I can give that course, and there is nobody else right now accessible to me who could give that. So I've done that. But from now on, Essential Foundation is about other idealists. It's about the historical work of people who are not here anymore and the present work of people who are keeping history alive, renewed, and yeah, full of energy, so to say, always reformulating itself, always reformulating knowledge that is very ancient, so it becomes accessible to more people. And I can see, and maybe it's a hope more than a prediction, it's probably a hope, but I can clearly see over the next several years that I would drift more and more towards my semi-invisible role at Essentia and less in my personal role as a public figure.
Yeah.
And that warms my heart.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even to say this, it's like, oh, I feel, that would be a nice time when it comes, when only the editors are visible in the Essentia website and not me. I'm
Yeah.
not anymore in the trenches, in the front line.
Yeah, and you have been in the trenches for a long time, and there is battle fatigue in that sense. And so, yeah, I think that's a beautiful place to arrive, or I mean, a great, healthy, balanced place for you to arrive. Is that the Essentia Foundation is, a monastery of sorts, and that you are among allies and so forth, and that
Well,
will afford you.
Essentia is fighting a battle, but
Mhm.
Essentia is more than me, and I play a role in Essentia.
Yeah.
But look, Justin, even this, I know it's to some degree an illusion, because for the past 6 months, I thought that's exactly what's happening. I'm drifting into that role of
Mhm.
background, because the books that are coming out from me now, Decoding Jung's Metaphysics and Science Ideated, are books I wrote in 2019
Yeah.
up to early 2020. So this is stuff that I wrote a while ago. It's just that the promotion cycle takes 10 months prior to publication. So I thought I was drifting into that role. And then suddenly something happens and my diamond drags me right back to the front line. Sam Harris gives that interview
Yeah.
in the Friedman podcast.
Well,
And I
that's the
just
tempt,
go,
the fruit, the forbidden fruit, right? And how can
oh,
you not? How can you not go
I can't. My
after?
diamond can't. So when that happened, it's like in an instant, violating laws of relativity and the speed
Yeah.
of light limit. In an instant, I was back in the warrior role, in the very front line with my sword drawn. It's irresistible,
Hmm.
and at least now I accept that it's irresistible. I don't
Yeah.
fight it. I don't judge it. It's just the way it is.
Well,
But I do entertain the fantasy that that will happen less and less, and I would
yeah.
drift more and more into obscurity.
And where you are presently, I think you can afford yourself the discretion through wisdom to pick those fights judiciously. So Sam Harris is a good opportunity to make an example of something that's just completely whack and crazy.
Oh, it was an eeasy one, because I
Right.
have been privately very critical of what Sam Harris has been doing for 10 years.
Mhm.
Well, nine. It,
2012,
when he
like you said.
published a horrendous attack piece on the integrity and character of Ibn Alexander in 2012,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I went berserk. I thought,
Mhm.
this guy doesn't know the man. And he basically suggested that Ibn Alexander was a butcher, that he cuts brains instead of studying them. I mean, it was a disgusting piece. So I have been fuming since then, and it only got worse. His generalizations. I hate generalizations. And Sam Harris is all about generalizations. Even his PhD thesis, the central hypothesis was religious people have different patterns of thinking. Their brains are different. I abhor this kind of thinking. I completely abhor that, because it eliminates humanity. Humanity is about our differences. And generalizing and using that as an artifact to pass judgment on entire groups of people, I abhor that. So I have been simmering inside for more than 9 years. So when I saw that interview, it's just like I was primed already.
Yeah, yeah. And listen, I mean, if it's to a good end, so be it. Because again, picking your fights judiciously, or your confrontation, because I am an out of the closet confrontation addict. I grew up having to fight every single day to not be destroyed by a malignant narcissist and a psychopath. So I love fighting. But it's not part of what I'm trying to do going forward. I'll pull it out if it's necessary, but I'd rather be more of a anyway. But I totally
have that too. That fighting instinct.
Yeah.
I have always had it since I was a child.
Yeah, and I'm surprised it hasn't gotten me killed. I'm surprised I haven't been shot or something. I have been shot actually, but it wasn't personal. There were a couple of times that I've been into fights and stuff. It wasn't that. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, I think you survey where you are in a particular period of time and see what's right for you. But I think you can have your cake and eat it too, in a way. I think is what I'm getting out of this is that you through wisdom and discretion and jump in the fray when necessary, or hop in the ring and go a couple rounds with somebody.
I don't get to choose it, but when that happens, but
yeah, well, it's like the Harris,
right,
like the Harris situation. But and I think again, you've done a lot and you have the potential to do a lot more, but I don't know how you compromise with the diamond. I don't know how you co-create or what's the word, emulate, or whatever it is. There could be a whole thing right there that somebody could work on and try to figure out. And of course the daimon is a sort of metaphor essentially, but I think it's that force, it's that driving force. It's the will to.
Thank goodness I found a way to dance that dance.
Mm-hmm.
So in the beginning it was not the case. I was at war constantly with the diamond. Today I found a place for productive co-living,
right.
so to say.
Right.
So I'm okay now.
Well, Bernardo, I think we can stop here and let people digest what you and I have talked about. I hope this was good content for those of you who are still. And you know what? That's what I love about people who follow your work, is they will watch a 4-hour interview. I do. I sat through Kurt John DeMingle's 7.5 hours with you and John, and I've watched 33 hours of John's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So I commit. I'm not instant gratification. I am ADD. Sometimes I have to walk away and go do something, or I'll go nuts. But I commit, and I know you have a lot of people who follow you who commit. So I know there are still, and it's even evident in the analytics of the last video that we watched, that people commit. And I think that's a good sign. Even if people don't may enjoy some conversations better than others, if they sit through it and listen to what you have to say. So I thank you so much for your time and your
Thanks
sharing.
for having me.
I hope this was just a good conversation, rather than feeling like you have to
sure
pull out the script and go over what you've gone over many times. I was hoping we could go into some novel territory today, and so I appreciate you taking that journey with me.
My pleasure.
I'll stay in touch with you, and maybe if you don't run off to the Swiss Alps and I can't reach you anymore, which I would understand and I wouldn't take it personally at all, but maybe I'll reach out to you next year and we'll check in with each other maybe 9 months to a year, and I can
okay.
have you back if that's good, if you're amenable to that. So
I'll probably be running around with a bloody nose for a while still. So
good. Well, I'm going to be there, because and I hope this isn't too Justin-centric, but you've inspired me. You've changed my trajectory a lot. The work that you presented and the way you presented it, it's given me pause to rethink because before I got to your work, I was highly motivated to help people and help with a transformative experience, but doing it in a way that is more sort of ethically grounded and more sensible, in the way that it's not just going to lead off to some guru type escapism or self-deception or salvation or messianic oriented. I want people to be aware of all that when they're coming to seek help and seek change for the psyche and the soul and all that kind of thing. Soul as a metaphor. But you've informed me a lot, and so I'm going forward in my direction with that, and I hope it nets good results. We'll see what happens. But I thank you for that. And I also thank you, and you mentioned this and then I'll finally shut up, is the last person you interviewed, the young man from Australia. you said that you prefer these smaller shows or series or whatever they are, podcasts. And I just want to acknowledge that and thank you that you will work with people who are not, slick production and big production. And you cited a good reason for that, because there's editorial things going on and things like that. So, but I just want to acknowledge and thank you for still connecting with folks who have tiny little shows, whatever they are, like myself.
Those are the folks that I'm speaking to. I mean, those are the people I'm interested in. So in a sense, it's completely consistent. It's nothing surprising what I'm doing, but yeah.
And I love to play the role of the average guy, the word John Q. Public here in the States, Quisequam man. It's the everyman. I love that term, the Quisequam man. And so that's my one of my characters that I have, my personas, is I'm the everyman. I'm not educated, but I'm not stupid. And so, but I'm curious and I'm always seeking new information and new ideas. And so, again, been part of that. So, Bernardo, thank you again. Thank you to the viewers out there on YouTube. I'll say goodbye to you after we stop recording. And again, thank you everyone who followed this conversation to the end. It's very much appreciated. I will have relevant links to those of you who are perhaps new to Bernardo's work to find him in the below this video, the description field. That's what I'm looking for. I'll have all means of contacting or finding Bernardo's work that way, including Essentia. So again, Bernardo, thank you. And we'll
my pleasure. Goodbye. Thanks, everybody.